Before America was a nation, it was a rebellion. Before there were stars and stripes, there were whispers in taverns, smuggled letters, and muskets hidden in barns. This isn't just the story of independence. It's the story of farmers, defying empires, of spies, slaves, and forgotten fighters who lit a fire the world couldn't put out. From the shot heard round the world to the birth of a radical idea called liberty, this is how America was forged, in blood, betrayal, and belief. Chapter 1. The Empire Cracks. In the year 1763, the world stood at the edge of a great shift, the 7 Years' War. What some called the first truly global conflict had finally ended. The British Empire emerged from it triumphant, but not unscathed. It now held dominion over vast swaths of territory, stretching from India to Canada, from the Caribbean to the American frontier. Never before had the British crown cast such a long shadow over the earth. But empires, like men, paid dearly for their victories. Britain's national debt had nearly doubled during the war. An island nation, wealthy, yes, but limited in manpower, in resources, in time, was suddenly burdened with the cost of policing and administering half the known world. The war had brought glory, but it had also brought a reckoning. Parliament turned its gaze westward, across the Atlantic, toward the American colonies. There were 13 of them then, sprawled along the eastern seaboard of North America, stretching from New Hampshire in the north to Georgia in the south. They were home to farmers, merchants, artisans, and preachers, immigrants and descendants of immigrants, pioneers, born of hardship, living in a land still raw with wilderness. They were British subjects, but their hearts and habits were becoming something else. For most of the 18th century, London had governed the colonies with a light touch. It was a policy of salutary neglect, an unspoken agreement to let the Americans manage their own affairs as long as they remained loyal and profitable. And they had been. Trade flourished. The American economy, though dependent on British markets, was growing. Towns expanded. Newspapers spread. A distinctly colonial culture had taken root, restless, enterprising, and increasingly self-aware. But after 1763, things began to change. The men of Parliament. It seemed obvious. The colonies had benefited enormously from the war. British soldiers had bled and died defending American frontiers from the French. Forts had been built. Trade routes secured. Surely the colonists, grateful and patriotic, would not object to paying their fair share, but the colonies saw it differently. In 1765, Parliament passed the Stamp Act. It was the first direct tax ever imposed on the colonies. Every legal document, every newspaper, every playing card and pamphlet would now require a royal stamp. The cost was minimal. The symbolism was not. For the colonists, the issue was not how much they were being taxed. It was who had the right to tax them at all. There were no colonial representatives in Parliament, no voice in the decisions that governed their lives. To the men in Boston, in Philadelphia, in Charleston, and New York, this was not law. It was fiat. Taxation without representation was tyranny. The reaction was swift and fierce. Colonial assemblies condemned the act. Merchants organized boycotts of British goods. Crowds marched in the streets. In Boston, an effigy of the royal tax collector was hung from the Liberty Tree, then cut down, beheaded, and burned. Homes were vandalized. Offices looted. The protest was loud, defiant, and unmistakably political. Across the ocean, the British government was stunned. They had expected grumbling, perhaps even delay. They had not expected organized resistance. But the colonists had found something in their defiance, something older than law and deeper than loyalty. A sense that their rights, their English rights, were being violated. And so, the Stamp Act was repealed. But the damage had been done. In its place, Parliament passed the Declaratory Act, asserting its full power and authority to make laws binding the colonies in all cases whatsoever. It was a legal statement, but also a warning. The empire would not be challenged. Yet with every law, every assertion of authority, the divide grew wider. In 1767 came the Townshend Acts, new duties on glass, paper, paint, and tea. Once again, colonists resisted. Boycotts returned. Tensions escalated. In 1768, British troops were sent to Boston, a city of narrow streets and passionate patriots. Soldiers clashed with civilians. Tempers flared. Resentments deepened. And then, on March 5, 1770, it happened that a group of colonists confronted a British sentry outside the customs house. Snowballs were thrown, then stones, then a club. Reinforcements arrived. Voices shouted. Muskets were raised. And in a sudden, chaotic burst, shots rang out. 5 men lay dead. Among them, Crispus Attucks, a man of African and native descent, who would become one of the Revolution's first martyrs. The British called it a riot. The colonists called it a massacre, and though tensions briefly eased, though the Townshend duties were mostly repealed, the sense of injustice remained. Like a crack in glass, the damage spread quietly, invisibly, beneath the surface. 3 years later, came Tea in 1773, Parliament passed the Tea Act, allowing the British East India Company to sell its surplus tea directly to the colonies, bypassing colonial merchants. It was an attempt to rescue a failing company and to reassert imperial authority. But to the colonists, it was yet another example of Britain favoring its own interests at the expense of American liberty. That December, in the dead of night, a group of men disguised as Mohawk Indians boarded 3 ships in Boston Harbor. In silence, they split open 342 chests of tea and dumped them into the dark, icy water below. The Boston Tea Party, they called it, was an act of protest, dramatic, theatrical, and unmistakably revolutionary. The British government responded. With fury. In 1774, Parliament passed the Coercive Acts, which the colonists soon dubbed the Intolerable Acts. The port of Boston was closed. The Massachusetts Charter was revoked. British officials gained sweeping powers. Soldiers were quartered in civilian homes. But instead of isolating Massachusetts, the punishment united the colonies. Sympathy turned to solidarity. Delegates from 12 colonies met in Philadelphia for the First Continental Congress. They declared their rights, organized militias, petitioned the king. But by then, the gears were already turning. In London, the colonial crisis was seen not as a political dispute, but as rebellion. And rebellion, in the British tradition, could only end in one of 2 ways: submission or war. Across the Atlantic, in taverns and town halls, the word liberty hung heavy in the air, not as a slogan, but as a summons. Something profound had changed. The colonies were no longer debating taxes. They were confronting an empire. And while many still hoped for reconciliation, still swore allegiance to the king, an undercurrent of resistance ran deep and strong. By the spring of 1775, British General Thomas Gage, now military governor of Massachusetts, received secret orders. He was to seize colonial weapons stored in Concord. Quietly, quickly, without bloodshed, if possible. But word leaked. Paul Revere wrote. The countryside stirred, and when British troops marched out of Boston in the pre-dawn hours of April 19th, they were not walking into a simple raid. They were marching into history. But that is another chapter. Here, at the close of the first, we leave the empire already cracking. A storm gathering on both shores of the Atlantic. Neither side yet knows the scale of what's to come. Neither side yet imagines the cost. But the fuse has been lit. And soon, all the world will hear it burn. Chapter 2. No voice, only chains. It began with paper, not swords. Not fire, not grand declarations, but ink and stamps. The year was 1765. The British Empire, weighed down by the staggering debts of the 7 Years' War, turned its attention to its most profitable children, the American colonies. The crown needed gold, and Parliament, confident in its authority, believed the colonies must pay their share. After all, had not British soldiers defended American soil? Had not fleets been sent, forts built, and enemies driven back from the frontier? Surely the colonists would understand. Surely they would obey. But they did not. In March of that year, The British Parliament passed a law unlike any that had come before. The stamp ACT.IT was, on the surface, a simple thing. A tax on printed materials, newspapers, licenses, legal documents, playing cards. Anything that bore official weight required a stamp. Purchased, of course, from agents of the crown. The fee was modest, mere pence. But the principle was enormous. This was the first direct tax imposed by Britain on its American colonies. Not on trade, but on daily life. It bypassed colonial assemblies. It came from London, unasked, unwelcomed, and unrepresented in taverns and meeting halls, in parlors and pulpit sermons. The question rose, echoing louder with each retelling that be why what right? Does a parliament across the ocean tax people who have no voice within it? The answer from London was clear. The colonies, they argued, were virtually represented. That the good of the empire was the good of all. That laws passed by Parliament applied to every subject under the king's dominion, regardless of where they lived or who they had voted for. But in America, this logic rang hollow. They were not citizens of Britain. They were colonists, self-reliant, hardened by distance, governed by local assemblies and town meetings. Their communities elected their own leaders. Their lives were built not on royal patronage, but on independence, forged by necessity and sealed by sweat. The slogan took root quickly, simple, furious, unignorable. No taxation without representation. From Massachusetts to South Carolina, the cry spread like wildfire. Newspapers printed scathing editorials. Merchants organized boycotts. Pamphlets flew off presses. And in the streets, especially in Boston, anger took on flesh. It was there, amid cobbled alleys and harbor wind, that resistance first bared its teeth. That on August 14, 1765, an effigy of Andrew Oliver, the man appointed to distribute the stamps, was found hanging from the Liberty Tree. A crowd gathered. The message was unmistakable. That night, Oliver's office was ransacked, his windows shattered. The next morning, he resigned. It didn't end there. A few days later, the home of Lieutenant Governor Thomas Hutchinson was stormed. Furniture smashed, paintings slashed, walls torn apart, decades of records, manuscripts, and books destroyed. He had done nothing to enforce the act. It didn't matter. He was the face of power, and power, now, was the enemy. And still, Parliament did not yield to British lawmakers. The reaction was absurd, petulant, childish. They had no intention of being dictated to by colonial mobs. Britain had ruled the seas, defeated France, governed a quarter of the globe. It would not be cowed by shoemakers and pamphleteers. But America was awakening. In October, delegates from 9 colonies gathered in New York. It was called the Stamp Act Congress, the first unified political response to British policy. They drafted petitions, spoke of rights inherited from English law, cited the Magna Carta, the Glorious Revolution. They were not revolutionaries, not yet. But the foundation was being laid. Resistance was not only political, it was personal. Every man, every household, faced the question, would you pay the tax or would you resist? And resistance became contagious. Groups calling themselves the Sons of Liberty formed in city after city. They were tradesmen, printers, apprentices, ordinary citizens, bound by the extraordinary idea that liberty must be defended, even at risk. They met in secret, communicated in code, organized protests, intimidated stamp agents, burned effigies. They were not an army, but they moved with precision, and when they struck with the fury of the unheard. Even women joined the cause. The Daughters of Liberty spun homespun cloth to replace British textiles. They brewed their own tea. They refused to buy imported goods, turning their households into quiet battlefields of economic defiance. And in the shops, the taverns, the shipping yards, British commerce began to feel the weight of silence. The boycott worked up early. 1766, merchants in London, losing profits daily, urged Parliament to reconsider. What bullets could not shake, missing coins had. Under mounting pressure, the Stamp Act was repealed. And in America, bells rang out. Churches held prayers of thanksgiving. Crowds cheered. Bonfires were lit. It was a moment of triumph, proof. It seemed that when the colonies stood together, they could bend the will of an empire, but celebration would be short-lived. For even as they repealed the Stamp Act, Parliament passed the Declaratory Act. A single sentence. Legalistic. Precise. Cold. It declared that Parliament had full authority to make laws binding the colonies in all cases whatsoever. All cases, the message was clear. The Crown had yielded. On the tax, but not on the principle. And so the struggle entered a new phase. The lines were no longer drawn around a single law. They now surrounded the very nature of governance. Who held power? Where it came from? What it meant to be a subject? And what it might mean to be something else. In the years that followed, new taxes would come. The Townshend Acts, the Tea Act, the Coercive Acts. But beneath them all was the same wound. Still open, still bleeding. In 1765, the colonists had not asked for independence. They had not burned the king in effigy. They had petitioned, protested, and demanded recognition of their rights as Englishmen. But London had seen them only as dependents, subjects to be governed, resources to be taxed, children who must obey. The empire had stopped listening, and in that silence, the seeds of revolution took root. Every pamphlet read by candlelight, every meeting whispered behind closed doors, every strike of a printing press, every voice that rose in protest, was a hammer blow against the chain that bound them. They had no seats in Parliament, no say in their laws, no protection for their grievances. No voice, only chains. But chains have limits. They can bind, they can silence. But when stretched too far, they snap. And when they do, the sound is heard not just in courtrooms or castles, but in fields and forests, in harbors and hearths, in every place where people refuse to be ruled without reason. That sound was coming. Soon, the colonists would no longer ask to be heard. They would demand it, with muskets, with flags, with fire. But that, too, is another chapter. Chapter 3, the Boston bloodshed. It was winter in Boston. Bitter, gray, the kind that settles into your bones and does not leave. The year was 1770, and the city was tense, choked by resentment, bristling with fear. For nearly 2 years, British troops had walked its cobbled streets, rifles on their shoulders, bayonets gleaming beneath low skies. They were meant to keep order, to remind the colonists who ruled and who obeyed. But their presence, constant, unyielding, felt more like an occupation than protection. Boston was no longer just a city. It had become a pressure chamber. The soldiers were young, many barely older than the boys they passed in the streets. They were tired, paid poorly, often jeered at, spit on, insulted by men who looked like farmers, merchants, and apprentices, but who carried the fury of a people pushed too far. To the redcoats, Boston was hostile ground. To the Bostonians, the soldiers were the iron fist of a king who refused to listen. Tensions simmered, disputes were constant, over jobs, over words, over space itself. Off-duty soldiers competed with locals for work. Tavern brawls erupted. Rumors swirled of plots and provocations. The people spoke not with fear, but with fury. And underneath it all, one question loomed larger than the rest. How much longer could this last before something broke? That question was answered on the evening of March 5. It began not with cannon fire or cries for war, but with snowballs. The streets near the custom house were dimly lit, flickering under oil lamps and moonlight. A British sentry, Private Hugh White, stood watch beneath the cold stone facade. A group of boys approached him, hurling insults. Then ice. Then chunks of coal. A bell rang out. Some said it was the fire bell. Others believed it was intentional, a signal. More colonists arrived. The crowd thickened. The air turned electric. Private White struck one of the boys with the butt of his musket. The crowd surged. Cries of bloody backs and lobster scoundrels echoed through the square. Tension snapped into chaos. A small unit of redcoats, 7 soldiers led by Captain Thomas Preston, rushed to the scene, muskets drawn, there, breath visible in the frigid air. They formed a line in front of the custom house. The mob swelled, dozens of men and boys, pressing closer, jeering, daring them to fire. Snowballs flew, then sticks, then a club. Someone struck a soldier. Another was knocked to the ground. The soldiers, nervous, surrounded, their fingers stiff on their triggers, stood shoulder to shoulder in the dark. What they saw, what they heard, what they felt, no one can say for certain. What happened next echoed through history. A shot rang out, then another, and another. The night exploded. When the smoke cleared, 5 colonists lay bleeding in the snow. Crispus Attucks, a dock worker of African and native descent, was the first to fall. He had stood at the front of the crowd, tall, unflinching, defiant. They said he took 2 bullets to the chest. His body lay sprawled in the street, surrounded by blood and silence. 4 others would die. Samuel Gray, James Caldwell, Samuel Maverick, and Patrick Carr. Several more were wounded. Boston was stunned. Captain Preston and his men were arrested. An investigation was launched. But the damage was done. The massacre, because that is what it was now called, was more than an isolated tragedy. It was a spark, and the men who shaped the revolution would not let it die in the cold. The first to seize the moment was Paul Revere, a silversmith by trade. Revere was also a passionate patriot and a master of political messaging. He engraved a powerful image, an illustration, of the shooting, depicting the British soldiers as a firing squad, mercilessly gunning down unarmed civilians. The dead are crumpled and weeping. The soldiers, robotic, expressionless, stand in rigid formation, led by a captain raising his sword. Above them, the words, "The bloody massacre perpetrated in King Street." It was not entirely accurate. It was not intended to be. It was propaganda, and it worked. Copies spread through the colonies like wildfire. The engraving was hung in taverns, printed in newspapers, pinned in meeting halls. To the public, the image told a story far more vivid than any trial could. A tyrannical empire, shedding colonial blood in the very streets of Boston. Proof, some said, of what Britain truly thought of its American children. But even in the heat of outrage, justice was demanded, not vengeance, and so, a trial was held. The defense attorney was John Adams. It was a strange thing. Adams, a man who would later help write the Declaration of Independence, who would one day serve as the second president of the United States, stood in court and defended the British soldiers. Not because he loved the crown, but because he believed in law, in fairness, in a system that held fast. Even when emotions ran high, he argued the soldiers had fired in self-defense, that they were provoked, afraid, surrounded, that there had been no order to shoot, only panic. The jury believed him. 2 soldiers were convicted, not of murder, but of manslaughter. The rest were acquitted. It was a verdict many accepted, but few forgot. Outside the courtroom, the wheels of revolution kept turning. The massacre became a rallying cry, an image, a date, a memory seared into the colonial imagination. Each March 5th, in Boston and beyond, orators would stand before crowds and retell the story. They would speak of martyrs, of blood in the snow, of an empire that no longer saw them as subjects, but as obstacles. And yet, the colonies did not rise in full rebellion. Not yet. There was still hope. Thin, fragile, flickering like a lantern in the wind, that the rift might be healed. That the king might listen. That Parliament might change course. But the massacre had changed the terms of the argument, and no longer was this just a debate about taxes, or trade, or representation. It had become a question of safety, of violence, of what a government might do when its authority was challenged, and it had revealed something else, something darker, that the power behind the red uniforms was not abstract. It had a trigger. It had bullets, and it was willing to use them. The Sons of Liberty knew it. The merchants knew it. The farmers knew it. From Boston to Virginia, whispers passed through homes and meeting houses, telling of how soldiers had gunned down citizens. In the street, the massacre was retold again and again, not just as fact, but as warning. And in that retelling, It grew to it became myth. Not because it was false, but because it struck at something deeper than truth. It struck at fear, at dignity, at the fragile line between order and oppression. Boston would never be the same. The snow would melt. The blood would fade. But the memory, the image, the name would remain. The Boston Massacre. It was not the start of the war, but it was the start of something irreversible. A break in trust, a fracture in loyalty, a glimpse into what rule by force might look like, what it already had looked like. The colonists had always imagined themselves as free men, loyal to the crown, yes, but governed by consent, by tradition, by the rights of Englishmen. That dream had now been pierced by 5 musket balls. In London, the event was dismissed. Unfortunate, they said. A tragic misunderstanding. They pointed to the acquittals, to the provocations, to the snowballs. But in America, they remembered. The blood, they remembered Tux, Gray, Caldwell, Maverick, Carr. They remembered that on a cold night in March, the king's soldiers fired on the king's subjects and then marched away. They remembered that silence, after the gunfire, was the sound of something ending. Not life, though life was lost. Not peace, though peace was shaken. What ended that night was the illusion, and when illusions die, nations are born. The blood had not yet dried when the story was already marching across the colonies, step by step, mile by mile, toward the next confrontation, toward protest, toward rebellion, toward a world reshaped, and that world was drawing closer. Chapter 4. Tea overboard. The harbor was still that night, cold and silent. The thin veil of fog drifted along the black water, swallowing lantern light and muffling sound. Boston lay hushed beneath a December moon, its streets blanketed in snow and tension. But in the shadow of the wharves, near Griffin's Dock, a different kind of storm was gathering. It was the 16th of December, 1773. And by morning, the entire British Empire would know what had happened here. 3 ships rocked gently at anchor: the Dartmouth, the Eleanor, and the Beaver. Their holds were heavy with East India Company tea, thousands of pounds of it, sent across the sea, to be sold under the protection of British law. But no dockworker had dared unload them. No merchant would pay the duty. No customs house would claim the cargo. For weeks, the ships had sat idle, not for lack of interest, but because of something deeper, something defiant, something dangerous. This tea was not just tea. It was a symbol. A test, and the people of Boston were about to give their answer. The trouble had begun months earlier, in Parliament, in an effort to rescue the struggling East India Company. Crippled by corruption and weighed down by unsold goods, British lawmakers passed the Tea Act. On paper, it was a compromise. It allowed the company to bypass colonial middlemen and sell its tea directly to the colonies at a lower price than ever before. Even with the tax, the tea would be cheaper than smuggled Dutch leaves. A bargain, they thought. A clever solution. But in Boston, and in every colonial town that called itself free, the Tea Act was seen for what it truly was: not a discount, but a trap. Yes, the tea was cheaper, but accepting it meant accepting the tax. It meant accepting Parliament's right to legislate for the colonies without their consent. It meant bowing, quietly, economically, to a principle the colonists had spent nearly a decade rejecting. The price of tea was not measured in shillings, but in sovereignty, and that they would not pay. Throughout the autumn, resistance grew. In ports up and down the coast, tea shipments were turned away or rotted in storage. But in Boston, the situation came to a head. Governor Thomas Hutchinson, firm in his loyalty to the crown and stubborn in his interpretation of duty, refused to allow the tea ships to depart without paying the duty. The tea would be unloaded, he insisted. The tax would be paid. The law would be upheld. The deadline was approaching. If the ships remained in the harbor beyond 20 days without unloading, their cargo would be seized and auctioned by customs officials, by force if necessary. Boston had 20 days to decide. The people chose sooner. That evening, as the deadline neared, thousands gathered at the Old South Meeting House. They filled the pews, the aisles, the windows. They listened to speeches, urgent, fiery, resolute. They voted, again and again, to demand the tea be sent back to England. But still, the governor refused. And as the meeting dragged on, something shifted in the room. No one said it outright, but all felt it. Words had reached their limit. As the final rejection rang out, a voice, firm, clear, and unshaken, broke the silence. This meeting can do nothing more to save the country. It was Samuel Adams, and in that moment, the course was set. A signal was given. A war whoop sounded in the night, and from every corner of the city, men began to move, swiftly, silently, with purpose. Some disguised themselves as Mohawk warriors, their faces painted, their coats roughened by the salt air. Others moved in plain clothes, cloaked by the shadows. They were shipbuilders and blacksmiths, printers and clerks, sons of merchants and farmers alike. Patriots, not soldiers, bound by a shared understanding. If liberty meant anything, it meant action. By the dozens, they descended on Griffin's Wharf. The watchmen on the ships did not resist. They were outnumbered. They were stunned, with practiced efficiency. The men boarded the Dartmouth, then the Eleanor, then the Beaver. Hatchways were flung open. Hoists were lowered. Chest after chest of tea, 342 in all, was hauled to the deck, split open with hatchets and knives, and emptied into the S.E.N.O. cargo was stolen. No property taken. Nothing touched but the tea. They worked for nearly 3 hours, and when they were done, the harbor was steeped in defiance. The scent of rebellion rose into the cold night air, mingling with salt and snow. The next morning, the news spread, first through Boston, then beyond. Riders carried the tale to New York, to Philadelphia, to Charleston, and soon across the Atlantic, in London. Outraged to the Lords of Parliament, to the ministers of the Crown. This was no mere protest. This was vandalism, anarchy, open rebellion. The loss was enormous. More than 90,000 pounds of tea, worth nearly 10,000 pounds sterling, ruined. A deliberate, public insult to royal authority, one which demanded a crushing reply. And it came, swiftly. Parliament passed a series of measures designed to punish Massachusetts and reassert imperial control. The Boston Port Act, the Massachusetts Government Act, the Administration of Justice Act, the Quartering Act. Together, they became known as the Coercive Acts. In the colonies, they were renamed the Intolerable Acts. The port of Boston was closed sealed, off until the tea was paid for. Commerce halted, trade strangled, the lifeblood of the city choked. The Massachusetts Charter was revoked. Town meetings were restricted. Justice itself was denied, as British officials gained the right to be tried in England. And worst of all, the army returned. Redcoats, quartered in private homes, billeted against the people's will. Occupiers in every sense of the word. The punishment was harsh, intended to isolate Boston, to make an example of it. But it had the opposite effect. Rather than dividing the colonies, the Tea Party and the Crown's furious response united them to towns and cities across the continent. Colonists saw not chaos, but courage. They sent food to Boston. They raised money. They passed resolutions of support. And they began to speak, not as Bostonians or Virginians or Pennsylvanians, but as Americans. In September of 1774, delegates from 12 colonies gathered in Philadelphia for the First Continental Congress. They drafted a petition to the king. They formed committees of correspondence. They organized militias. They called for unity, for resistance, and for readiness. The storm was no longer gathering. It had arrived, but in the heart of it stood that night in Boston, that moment when men, acting without orders, without arms, without violence, struck a blow not just against taxation, but against submission itself. A declaration, unwritten, unspoken, but undeniable, that we will not yield, that we will not be bought with cheaper tea or frightened by louder guns, that we are not subjects of convenience. We are citizens of principle. The Boston Tea Party was not just about tea. It was not even about taxes. It was about power and the refusal to bow to it without consent. It was about self-determination. about dignity, about the idea, radical, then essential now, that a people can govern themselves. And though no blood was spilled that night, though no shot was fired and no life was lost, it was, in many ways, the moment the revolution became inevitable. For once a people have tasted that kind of freedom, that kind of agency, they do not forget it. They do not return quietly to chains. They act. They resist. They fight and fight. They would. The tea was gone, but the consequences were just beginning. Chapter 5. The King's Iron Fist. The tea had barely settled on the bottom of Boston Harbor when the Crown struck back. It came not with musket or cannon, but with parchment and seal and fury. The British Empire, humiliated before the world, its authority openly mocked by a handful of colonists, chose force over reason. The time for negotiation, in the minds of ministers and monarch alike, was over. This was rebellion, and rebellion must be crushed. What followed were the intolerable acts. In London, they called them something else, the coercive acts, a set of punitive laws designed to discipline Massachusetts and, by extension, terrify the other colonies into submission. But to those who lived beneath their shadow, they were not laws, they were shackles. The first blow came with the Boston Port Act. Effective June 1, 1774, it closed the harbor to all commerce, imports, exports, fishing, until the East India Company was compensated for the destroyed tea. The lifeline of the city was severed. Wharves fell silent. Merchants watched their livelihoods collapse overnight. Ships stood idle in the bay, while families counted dwindling coins and empty barrels. It was not just punishment, it was starvation by decree, but the Crown did not stop there. Next came the Massachusetts Government Act. It dismantled the colonies. Self-rule, shattering a system that had existed for generations. The royal governor, appointed by the king, now had sweeping powers. The Colonial Assembly was effectively dissolved. Town meetings, those sacred spaces of local debate and governance, were restricted, permitted only with the governor's approval. The voice of the people was silenced. The Administration of Justice Act followed, delivering what colonists called the Murder Act. It allowed royal officials accused of crimes to be tried in England or another colony, where sympathetic courts and distant witnesses would shield them from consequence. It placed British power above colonial law. It made justice optional. And then came the quartering act. It required colonists to house British soldiers, whether in barracks, inns, or private homes. The army, once a foreign presence, now stepped across thresholds uninvited. Families watched as redcoats marched into their lives, not as guests, but as occupiers. Massachusetts. It felt like martial law in everything but name. The rest of the colonies, it felt like a warning. And yet, the Crown added one final insult. The Quebec Act, though not originally intended as punishment, it arrived in tandem with the others, and its timing was damning. It expanded the territory of Quebec southward into lands claimed by American colonists. It granted religious freedom to Catholics. It reinforced authoritarian governance in the region without elected assemblies or juries. To Protestant colonists, already choking on Parliament's heavy hand, the message was clear: you are not just subjects, you are afterthoughts. The response was not fear. It was fury, where Parliament hoped to divide the colonies, to isolate Massachusetts as a rebellious child. They instead forged unity. The colonies rallied. In towns from New Hampshire to Georgia, church bells rang for Boston. Public fasts were declared. Donations poured in: flour, meat, money, firewood. Wagons groaned under the weight of provisions bound northward. Children carried loaves. Farmers hauled crates. An injury to one had become an injury to all, and from this moment, something new emerged. Not just sympathy, not just outrage, but identity. The colonies began to speak not as scattered provinces, but as a people. They formed committees, networks of communication and resistance. Letters flew from one city to the next. Riders galloped down dirt roads carrying warnings, resolutions, plans. Local militias drilled in fields and forests. Guns were cleaned. Powder was stored. eyes turned from individual grievances to common cause. In September of 1774, delegates from 12 of the 13 colonies gathered in Philadelphia. It was the first time such a meeting had ever taken place. The First Continental Congress. They came not as rebels, but as Englishmen, defending ancient rights. Men like George Washington, Patrick Henry, Samuel Adams, John Jay, Richard Henry Lee. They wore different clothes, spoke in different dialects, brought different concerns from their colonies. But under the vaulted ceiling of Carpenter's Hall, they found alignment. They debated fiercely, argued over words, feared too much or too little. But when the dust settled, they stood together. They declared the intolerable acts null and void. They pledged to boycott British goods. They issued a petition to the king, pleading for justice, yet demanding liberty. And quietly, they began to prepare for war. Militias were formed. Arms were gathered. Maps were studied. If Britain would not yield, then resistance must come. And if resistance brought blood, so be it. The colonies had been pushed to the edge. But they had not fallen. Instead, they had linked hands. In Massachusetts, the countryside stirred with purpose. Farmers drilled before dawn. Bells signaled alarms. Gunpowder was hidden in barns and cellars. The Sons of Liberty moved with quiet precision, watching, warning, waiting. Across the sea, the king remained unmoved. George III. This was not negotiation. It was sedition. He saw only disorder, only subjects too bold for their place. He believed the trouble was isolated, exaggerated by radicals and loudmouths. He believed, fervently, that force would restore obedience. But the truth had changed. This was no longer about attacks, no longer about tea, no longer even about Parliament's reach. It was about the very soul of governance. Was power born from consent or command? Were these colonies possessions or partners? And if liberty could be revoked at will, then what worth did it truly hold? In the taverns of New England, in the parishes of Virginia, in the streets of Philadelphia, these questions echoed, like cannon fire not yet heard. Preachers turned sermons into cries for freedom. Newspapers published resolutions and poems. Children learned the names of martyrs and called them heroes. And always, behind every debate, every march, every letter, sent across land and sea, loomed the image of a harbor strangled by blockade, a city punished for defiance, a people pushed against the wall. Boston had become the battleground, but the war, if it came, would not be Boston's alone. It would be fought in valleys and hills, on rivers and fields, in hearts and minds. It would not be clean. It would not be quick, but it would be theirs. The king had reached for the iron fist, but in doing so, he had awakened something deeper than resistance. He had awakened revolution. Chapter 6. Whispers of Revolution. They met in shadows behind closed doors, in back rooms and cellars, in barns lit by oil lamps, in churches long after sermons had ended. They gathered quietly, cautiously, their voices low and their eyes scanning the streets beyond the windows. In a time when silence could be mistaken for safety and speech could be branded as treason, they chose to speak anyway. These were the early architects of rebellion. They were not generals. Not yet. They wore no uniforms. They gave no orders. But they carried messages, carefully folded, smuggled beneath floorboards, passed from hand to hand across colonies divided by rivers and mountains, customs and dialects. And through those messages, the colonies began to breathe as one. They were called the Committees of Correspondence, an idea born in the fevered mind of Samuel Adams, fiery, unrelenting, and fiercely loyal to the cause of liberty. He saw the growing danger. He knew that isolated protest would fail, that disconnected voices would be drowned out by the roar of empire. So he proposed a network, not of soldiers, but of scribes, not of muskets, but of INK. In 1772, the first committee took form in Boston. Its purpose was simple and radical: to document British abuses, to spread news, to forge unity where once there had been distance. Other towns soon followed: Salem, Concord, Newburyport. And beyond Massachusetts, the idea caught fire. By the end of 1773, nearly every colony had a committee of its own. These were the nervous systems of a growing body. They pulsed with warnings and resolutions, with news of troop movements and legislative overreach. When Parliament struck, the committees were first to react. When soldiers marched, it was the committees that sent riders galloping down darkened paths, their saddlebags stuffed with paper, their words more dangerous than powder. But something deeper stirred beneath the surface. These weren't just exchanges of information. They were tests of identity. For the first time, colonists began to see themselves not just as Bostonians or New Yorkers, not just as Virginians or South Carolinians, but as something larger, something forming, Americans, and the whisper grew. Louder by 1774, that whisper turned into motion. The Crown's crackdown, swift, brutal, and unapologetic, pushed the colonies to the edge. Boston's harbor was sealed, her economy strangled, her streets patrolled by redcoats, her people hungry, angry, resolute. And still, the tea remained unpaid. From town to town, couriers carried the news of Britain's fury. The intolerable acts, they were called now, named not by Parliament, but by the people who lived beneath their weight. The message was unmistakable: submission or ruin. But rather than divide the colonies, the king's iron grip bound them closer in taverns. In churches, on porches and courthouse steps, a question began to rise. Timid at first, then louder. Should we meet? Not in secret, not in scattered whispers, but openly, united, as colonies, as brothers. And so they came. 12 colonies, each sending their chosen men, merchants, lawyers, farmers, preachers, planters, some famous, some still unknown. They traveled for weeks across rutted roads, through rain and late summer heat, their minds full of uncertainty and purpose. The destination was Philadelphia, the place. Carpenter's Hall. It was not grand. It did not need to be. Its walls would hold something more powerful than opulence: conviction. This was the first Continental Congress. It began on September 5, 1774. Inside those walls stood men whose names would echo through history: George Washington, tall and grave; Patrick Henry, voice sharp as flint; Samuel Adams, eyes burning; John Adams, voice steady; and a young lawyer from Virginia, still quiet, still watching: Thomas Jefferson. But they did not arrive as revolutionaries. Not yet. They came as delegates, representatives, men sent by their people not to declare war, but to seek justice, to send a message, not to Parliament alone, but to the king himself. What they debated was not independence. What they debated was whether liberty could still live within the empire. The sessions were long, tense. Arguments erupted. Some feared rebellion. Others demanded it. They debated boycotts, petition drafts, methods of resistance. And above all, they debated unity. What bound Massachusetts to Georgia? What did a shoemaker in Boston have in common with a tobacco grower in Virginia? Could 13 separate colonies, with 13 separate governments, possibly speak with one voice? The answer came slowly. But it came. They resolved to support Massachusetts. They resolved to resist the intolerable acts. And they agreed to an economic boycott of British goods, enforced not by soldiers, but by the people themselves. Imports cut. Exports stopped. Trade sacrificed for principle, and they drafted a message. A petition to the king. In it, they laid out their grievances. Calmly, respectfully, but with undeniable clarity. They did not call for revolution. They did not threaten war. They asked only for the rights long promised to Englishmen: to govern themselves, to trade freely, to be taxed only with consent. They begged George III to listen, to see not enemies, but loyal subjects seeking dignity. They sent it across the sea, and they waited, but they did not stand still. They organized the Continental Association, an agreement among the colonies to uphold the boycott. They appointed local committees to enforce it. Neighbors turned into watchmen. Storefronts were monitored. Smuggled goods were burned. Even fashion became political. Homespun over silk. rebellion over refinement. They set a date to reconvene the following spring, May 1775. And then they returned home, but they returned. Changed. What began as a Congress of Colonies was now something more. It was the first step toward nationhood. Unofficial, unrecognized, but unmistakable. The whispers had become voices, and those voices were preparing for war. Throughout the winter, militias drilled in frozen fields. Blacksmiths forged musket parts. Powder horns were filled. Maps were drawn. British spies watched nervously. Royal governors sent reports, pleading for more troops. They saw the mood shifting. They saw the silence cracking. The colonies were not shrinking back. They were sharpening their edges. Still, in London, the danger was dismissed. The king's ministers believed the Congress was nothing but noise, that when pressed, the colonies would splinter, that fear would overcome fire, that the distance of oceans would outmatch the strength of paper. But they misjudged the hunger for freedom. They misjudged the memory of insult, of wounded pride, of neighbors taken from homes, of sons struck down in alleys, of harbors closed and laws overturned by decree. And they misjudged the power of a letter. That petition to the king, signed with care, sent with respect, was the last hope for peace. When it arrived in London, it was read and set aside. No reply came to no olive branch. No gesture of good faith. Only more ships, more soldiers, more orders. The silence was deafening. In America, the message was heard loud and clear. Reconciliation had failed, and in the stillness that followed, a question, unspoken but present in every heart, began to rise. If our voices cannot be heard, must our guns be? The whisper was gone now. The halls of Congress had echoed with it. The taverns had carried it. The committees had inked it. It had crossed mountains and rivers, seas and seasons. But now, it gave way to something louder. Boots on frozen ground, steel sharpened in secret. Orders passed beneath starlight. The revolution no longer waited on parchment. It was stepping into daylight. Chapter 7. The shot heard round the world. The night of April 18th, 1775, was thick with tension, a heavy silence that pressed on the hearts of men across Massachusetts. The air was cool and damp, the stars veiled by drifting clouds as British troops prepared for a march that would ignite a revolution. In Boston, the city buzzed quietly as lanterns swung along narrow streets and whispers passed between neighbors. But beyond the harbor, in the towns of Lexington and Concord, alarm bells had begun to toll in the minds of patriots who sensed that the hour of reckoning was near. For months, the colonial militias, farmers, blacksmiths, merchants, and tradesmen had trained in secret, their muskets polished, their powder dry. They were not soldiers by profession, but by necessity. They believed deeply in the rights of Englishmen, but now they prepared to defend those rights with steel and lead. The British command had received orders to seize the arms stockpiled in Concord, to disarm the militias before rebellion could fully take root, to reassert control by force, if necessary. Around midnight, under the cover of darkness, some 700 British regulars, redcoats, disciplined and battle-hardened, marched out from Boston, crossing the Charles River by boat. Their steps echoed in the quiet streets, a deliberate rhythm of power and intent. But the colonists were ready. Riders had been dispatched earlier that evening. Paul Revere, William Dawes, and Samuel Prescott, racing through countryside roads and forests to warn that the regulars are coming. Villagers awoke to the sound of hooves pounding and bells ringing. Doors creaked open. Muskets were lifted from dusty shelves. Men poured into the night, driven by fear, defiance, and hope. At dawn, the British column reached Lexington Green. There, about 70 militiamen stood in formation, led by Captain John Parker. They were vastly outnumbered. Their muskets were old, their experience limited. The tension was palpable. A British officer ordered the militia to disperse. Parker replied with steady resolve, "Stand your ground. Don't fire unless fired upon. But if they mean to have a war, let it begin here." Moments later, a shot rang out, No one knows for certain who fired first. Some say a lone gunshot from the Colonial side. Others claim a nervous British soldier. But that single bullet shattered the fragile peace. The Battle of Lexington had begun. Gunfire erupted across the green. Smoke curled into the crisp morning air. The militiamen fired a brief volley, then scattered, wounded and shaken. 8 lay dead, 10 more wounded. The British pressed on, moving toward Concord at Concord. The colonists had hidden their weapons well. When the redcoats arrived, they found little. But as British troops searched, militias from neighboring towns assembled, growing in numbers by the hour. When the British reached the North Bridge, a standoff formed. Hundreds of colonists faced off against hundreds of soldiers. The tension thickened until, again, gunfire broke the stillness. The colonists fired. 2 soldiers fell. The British retreated. The battle had turned. From that moment, the skirmishes multiplied. Militiamen picked off the redcoats from behind trees, fences, and stone walls. The British, exhausted and harried, fought to retreat back to Boston, enduring relentless attacks along the way by nightfall. Hundreds of British soldiers were casualties. The shot heard round the world was no mere phrase. It was a seismic rupture, an echoing declaration that the colonies would not submit quietly. The age of peaceful protest was over. Word spread swiftly. Patriots hailed the brave Minutemen who stood their ground. Loyalists feared the chaos to come. The British Crown faced a rebellion it had long sought to prevent. In the days that followed, militias swelled, fortifications rose, and a new chapter in history was written in the blood of Lexington and Concord. The war for American independence had begun. Chapter 8. The Siege of Boston. As the first gunfire faded into the distant hills of Lexington and Concord, a new reality settled over the land. A reality of siege and standoff, of patience and resolve. Boston, once a bustling colonial hub, now became a city under siege. The British forces, some 6,000 strong, found themselves hemmed in, trapped within the narrow peninsula by an ever-growing ring of colonial militias. These were not seasoned soldiers, but farmers and tradesmen who had taken up arms out of necessity and conviction. They surrounded the city with determination, encamping on the heights and roads leading in and out, cutting off supplies and movement. The siege of Boston had begun. Within weeks, the Massachusetts countryside transformed into a vast encampment of hope and hardship. Fires burned each night in campfires across the ridges, as men kept watch, sharpened weapons, and listened for the sounds of enemy movement. The air was thick with cold and uncertainty, the nights punctuated by the cries of sentries and the rumble of distant cannon. But leadership was needed, someone to bring order to the chaos, to mold scattered militias into an army capable of challenging the might of the British Empire. That someone was George Washington. On June 17, 1775, the Continental Congress appointed Washington commander-in-chief of the newly formed Continental Army. He arrived in Cambridge, Massachusetts, the very heart of the siege. A few weeks later, Washington was a man of measured demeanor, reserved, thoughtful, yet resolute. He understood the gravity of the task ahead. The British were professional soldiers, battle-hardened and well-equipped. The colonists were ragged, poorly supplied, and inexperienced. But Washington brought something invaluable: vision and unwavering commitment. He set about transforming the disparate militias into a disciplined force. Drills were intensified, supplies scoured from every source, discipline instilled. For months, Washington walked among his men, listening, encouraging, training, building not just an army, but a cause. Yet, the siege dragged on with little change. British forces controlled the city, its ports, its streets, while the colonists encamped just beyond their reach, unwilling to strike without an advantage. That advantage would come from a place many miles away, the remote fort of Ticonderoga. On the western edge of New York's Lake Champlain, Fort Ticonderoga was a strategic gem, guarding a vital waterway between Canada and the colonies. It was lightly defended, and more importantly, it housed a cache of artillery, heavy cannons and mortars capable of turning the tide of any siege. In May 1775, a bold plan was set into motion, led by Ethan Allen and Benedict Arnold. A small force of Green Mountain Boys crossed Lake Champlain in boats under cover of darkness. The fort was captured without bloodshed in a surprise dawn attack. The colonists seized dozens of cannons and other artillery, massive weapons that could change the balance of power. But transporting these cannons from Ticonderoga to Boston was an epic endeavor. Through rugged terrain, muddy roads, dense forests, and harsh weather, teams of soldiers, farmers, and oxen hauled the heavy guns over 300 miles. It was a journey of grit and determination, made through winter's grip. By early 1776, the cannons arrived at the heights overlooking Boston, at a place called Dorchester Heights. From this vantage, the colonists had a commanding view of the city and harbor, the very lifelines of the British forces. Placing artillery here meant that the British fleet in the harbor and their troops in the city were suddenly vulnerable. Washington acted swiftly. Under cover of night, soldiers and engineers built fortifications around the cannons, hauling timber, digging trenches, and setting up defensive positions. When dawn broke, the British awoke to an alarming sight. The colonists had fortified the heights, with heavy guns trained on their ships and positions. The British commander, General William Howe, faced a grim choice. Attacking the fortified heights would mean heavy casualties. Remaining risked bombardment and siege. Faced with no good options, Howe ordered a withdrawal that on March 17, 1776, British ships slipped out of Boston Harbor under the cover of fog. The siege was lifted, Boston was free, but the victory was more than strategic. It was symbolic. The colonists had stood firm. They had endured months of hardship and uncertainty. And with ingenuity and courage, they had forced the greatest military power in the world to retreat. The siege of Boston marked a turning point. It showed the world and the colonies that the Revolution was no fleeting rebellion, but a serious and sustained fight for independence. That Washington's leadership, the valor of the militias, and the daring capture of Ticonderoga's cannons combined to forge a new chapter in the war, one where hope began to outshine despair, and the dream of freedom became tangible. Boston streets, once filled with redcoats and royal flags, now echoed with the footsteps of patriots. The city would remain a symbol of British power lost and American resolve gained. And beyond Boston, across rivers and valleys, the fires of revolution continued to spread, lighting the path toward a nation yet to be born. Chapter 9. Bunker Hill, Blood for Resolve. The summer of 1775 was a crucible, fire and smoke and iron. The kind of moment when history bends under the weight of sacrifice and determination. The siege of Boston had tightened its grip. The Colonial militias entrenched on the hills that ringed the city, and the British forces desperate to break the encirclement. Among those hills, one would become a symbol, a hill soaked in blood, carved into memory by courage. The Battle of Bunker Hill, though called Bunker Hill, much of the fighting occurred on nearby Breed's Hill. The date was June 17, 1775. In the early morning haze, under skies heavy with anticipation, Colonial troops hurried to build fortifications. They worked through the night, digging trenches, piling earth, fashioning crude breastworks. Their leader, Colonel William Prescott, famously ordered, "Don't fire until you see the whites of their eyes." The command was born of necessity, conserving limited ammunition against a better-armed enemy. The British, under General Thomas Gage, viewed the colonial positions as a threat to their hold on Boston. Control of the high ground meant control of the harbor, the city, and potentially the entire campaign. Gage resolved to strike swiftly. That morning, the Redcoats marched. Over 2,200 British soldiers, drilled and disciplined, advanced in formation. Across the fields, their muskets and bayonets gleaming. They faced roughly 1,500 colonial militiamen, farmers, artisans, tradesmen, many with little formal training, yet fueled by fierce resolve. The first assault met with devastating colonial fire. The British ranks thinned under musket volleys, their disciplined lines wavering. But they pressed forward, rallying again and again, driven by orders and pride. The battle turned brutal, hand-to-hand combat, smoke thick in the air, cries of pain and courage intermingling. The colonists fought fiercely, but ammunition ran dangerously low. Eventually, the British forces overwhelmed the defenses, forcing the colonists to retreat. The price was heavy. Over 1,000 British casualties, killed or wounded, their highest losses in a single battle to date. Colonial losses, though fewer, were deeply felt. Nearly 450 men dead, wounded, or missing. Among the fallen was Dr. Joseph Warren, a prominent patriot leader and voice of the cause. Though the British claimed victory by capturing the ground, the battle was anything but a triumph. The heavy losses shocked the army and the British public alike. It was a clear sign that the colonists were willing to endure immense sacrifice for their freedom. For the patriots, Bunker Hill was a baptism by fire, a proof of their resolve, a testament to their courage. It showed that, though untrained and outgunned, they could stand against the world's most powerful military. The battle energized the revolution, galvanizing support and strengthening the spirit of resistance. Bunker Hill was not the end, that it was only the beginning. Chapter 10. A Declaration in the Making. The year was 1776, and the air in the 13 colonies was charged with a restless energy, a simmering fervor that was growing louder by the day. The siege of Boston persisted, and battles had been fought, and lives sacrificed, but the war now stretched beyond muskets and cannon fire. It had seeped into parlors, printing presses, churches, and taverns. That it was a war of ideas, of words, and of visions for a future not yet realized. Political debate crackled like electricity across the colonies. From Philadelphia to Charleston, leaders wrestled with a question that divided friends, families, and colonies alike. Should the American colonies sever their ties to Great Britain altogether? For years, many had hoped for reconciliation. They yearned for compromise, an end to taxation without representation, the repeal of oppressive laws, and respect for colonial rights within the framework of the empire. But the British crown remained resolute, and Parliament's grip tightened. In this crucible of uncertainty, a pamphlet emerged that would change everything. Common Sense, written by Thomas Paine, a recent immigrant from England, was a lightning bolt striking the consciousness of America. Paine's words were sharp, clear, and incendiary. His voice was not that of an aristocrat or scholar, but of an everyman, speaking plainly to farmers, laborers, merchants, and soldiers alike. He did not mince words. That he called the monarchy an absurd and unjust institution. He condemned the hereditary succession of kings as a dangerous form of tyranny. He laid bare the contradictions of loyalty to a distant king who taxed and ruled without consent. Most of all, he argued that the time for negotiation was over. Independence was not just necessary. It was inevitable. Paine wrote, "These are the times that try men's souls." His pamphlet spread like wildfire. Printed, copied, read aloud in public squares and private homes, it stirred the hearts of many who had been hesitant, who had clung to hopes of peace. It gave voice to the deep frustration and yearning for liberty that simmered beneath the surface. But not all embraced the call for independence. Some feared the consequences. They worried about the cost: war, chaos, uncertainty. They questioned the colony's ability to govern themselves, to defend against the British might. Loyalists remained steadfast in their allegiance to the crown, believing that rebellion would bring ruin. Within the halls of the Continental Congress, debates raged. The question of independence was no small matter. It was a decision that would forever alter the course of history, carrying with it immense risk and hope. John Adams, a passionate advocate for independence, saw the moment coming. He believed that America must seize the opportunity to define its own destiny. Others, like John Dickinson, urged caution, preferring continued appeals to the king. The Continental Congress, meeting in Philadelphia, became a crucible of ideas. Delegates argued day and night. balancing fear and conviction. The world was watching, and the colonies were on the brink as the debates unfolded. The seeds of a bold declaration were planted that a committee was formed: Thomas Jefferson, John Adams, Benjamin Franklin, Roger Sherman, and Robert Livingston, to draft a document that would announce to the world the colony's decision. Jefferson, young and eloquent, took up his pen to write what would become a masterpiece of political philosophy and rhetoric. His words would not only justify the colony's separation, but articulate universal principles of human rights, liberty, and justice. The Declaration of Independence was in the making, but before its final form, the idea of independence had to settle in the hearts and minds of a people caught between loyalty and revolution. Thomas Paine's common sense had helped tilt the balance. It had transformed vague hopes into clear demands. By the spring of 1776, the call for independence was no longer whispered. It was proclaimed in pamphlets, speeches, and conversations across the land. The revolution was no longer a protest. It was a declaration, and soon, the world would hear it. The journey toward that moment was paved with uncertainty, courage, and a deep belief in the right to self-governance. In those months, the colonies were not just fighting a war of muskets. They were fighting a war of words, a war for the very idea of freedom. And the Declaration was the battle cry, a beacon that would shine across oceans and centuries, an invitation to a new nation to be born. Chapter 11. July 4th, 1776. The summer sun rose over Philadelphia on July 4th, 1776, casting a golden light on a city alive with anticipation and uncertainty. The Continental Congress had gathered for weeks in the sweltering heat of independence Hall, debating, revising, and ultimately embracing a moment that would shake the foundations of empires and reshape the destiny of peoples. The Declaration of Independence, the document that would proclaim, in the most profound and enduring terms, the birth of a new nation, was ready. Thomas Jefferson, the young Virginian whose pen had traced words of liberty and equality, watched as his vision was about to take flight. His eloquence had been tempered by revision, his ideals sharpened by debate, but the core truth remained, that all men are created equal, endowed with unalienable rights, among them life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. On that day, the Congress voted unanimously to sever ties with Great Britain. The 13 colonies, once subjects of the Crown, declared themselves free and independent states. The room was filled with a mix of solemnity and hope. John Hancock, President of the Congress, signed the document with a flourish so bold that his name became synonymous with a signature of conviction. Outside, the news would spread slowly at first, carried by horsemen, printed in newspapers, read aloud in public squares. But its impact was immediate and electric. Citizens gathered to hear the words read aloud, their faces illuminated with a mixture of awe and resolve. The Declaration was more than a political statement. It was a manifesto of human rights, a bold assertion that government's power derives from the consent of the governed, and that when a government becomes destructive, it is the right of the people to alter or abolish it. These ideas were revolutionary, radical, and dangerous. To the British Crown, they were treason. To many around the world, they were a beacon of hope. Jefferson's words echoed across continents, inspiring movements and revolutions, challenging monarchies and empires. The Declaration of Independence was not just an American document. It was a universal call to liberty, but the joy of independence was tempered by the grim realities of war. The British Empire would not relinquish its colonies easily. The fight for freedom was just beginning. Yet, on that July day, a new nation was born, not in armies or battles, but in the hearts and minds of a people daring to claim their right to self-determination. The Declaration of Independence was a promise, a challenge, and a hope, a testament that the flame of liberty, once ignited, can never be extinguished. Chapter 12. Flags and Betrayals. The Revolutionary War was not merely a clash between colonies and empire. It was a fracture within communities, families, and hearts. Beneath the banners of rebellion fluttered complex allegiances, shifting loyalties, and the raw realities of survival. The war drew lines that cut deep between patriots and loyalists, settlers and native tribes, enslaved Africans and masters, revealing a nation divided as much as it was united. The red, white, and blue of the emerging American flag symbolized freedom and independence for many. But for others, the Union Jack remained a symbol of stability, order, and allegiance to a crown they had served for generations. Loyalists, sometimes called Tories, were a substantial and significant portion of the colonial population. They were individuals who chose to stand by the British Empire, whether out of loyalty, pragmatism, fear, or conviction. Many were government officials, clergy, merchants who benefited from imperial trade, or those wary of the chaos that revolution promised. The Loyalists believed that rebellion would bring devastation, that the crown was a protector of their rights, not an oppressor. Their loyalty was not blind. It was rooted in their vision of what America should be, a part of a greater empire, secure and governed by law. Yet, to the patriots, Loyalists were traitors. Their communities became battlegrounds of suspicion and violence. Loyalist homes were boycotted, their property seized or destroyed. Some faced imprisonment, exile, or even execution. The war, in this sense, was civil, a bitter struggle between neighbors and kin. Native American tribes found themselves in an impossible position, caught between two worlds. Many tribes sought to protect their lands and people amid the encroaching tide of settlers and warfare. Some sided with the British, who promised to limit colonial expansion westward. The Crown had long negotiated with tribes through treaties, and many native leaders believed supporting the British was the lesser evil. The Iroquois Confederacy, a powerful alliance of tribes, was itself divided. Some nations supported the British, others the Patriots, and still others tried to remain neutral, navigating a perilous balance to survive. For Native Americans, the war was not about independence, it was about survival. They fought to protect their territories, their cultures, and their way of life. Yet, regardless of allegiance, the war brought immense suffering, displacement, and devastation to Native communities. Meanwhile, enslaved Africans faced a complex and harrowing choice. Enslavement was brutal, a denial of freedom itself, the very principle that the Revolution claimed to uphold. Some enslaved people sought freedom by joining the British, who promised emancipation to those who fought against the rebels. The British proclamations, like Lord Dunmore's in Virginia, offered a beacon of hope amid the darkness of bondage. Thousands of enslaved men and women escaped their masters to join British lines, risking peril and betrayal for a chance at liberty. Yet, the patriot cause was conflicted. While many leaders spoke of freedom, the reality of slavery persisted deeply within the colonies, especially in the South. Some patriots feared that arming enslaved people or promising freedom would undermine the social order. Thus, enslaved Africans navigated a treacherous landscape. Some sided with the British, others with the patriots, and many seized opportunities where they could, carving out fragile spaces of freedom amid a brutal war. This patchwork of loyalty and betrayal fractured the colonies, making the war not just a fight for independence, but a crucible testing the very notions of identity and freedom. Neighbors turned against neighbors. Families were torn apart. Towns and cities became battlegrounds of suspicion and violence. Loyalties shifted with the winds of circumstance and survival. The revolution was as much a personal struggle as a political one, a war where flags meant not only nations but choices. Between hope and fear, allegiance and defiance, survival and loss. In this tumultuous tapestry, the meaning of freedom was contested, lived, and fought over, by patriots raising banners of revolution, loyalists clinging to empire, native peoples striving to defend their homelands, and enslaved Africans risking everything for a chance to be free. The war was never simple. It was never clean. It was messy, painful, and deeply human. And it was this complexity that shaped the birth of a nation, one forged not only in battle but in the tangled lives and shifting loyalties of its people. Chapter 13. The Empire Strikes Back. The summer of 1776 hung heavy with tension and uncertainty as the young American Revolution entered a perilous new phase. The colonies had declared their independence just weeks earlier, boldly severing political ties with Great Britain. Yet, that declaration was little more than ink on parchment without the power to secure it. Across the Atlantic, the British Empire was mobilizing its vast military might to crush the rebellion and reclaim its wayward colonies. The eyes of the empire were fixed on New York, a strategic jewel whose capture could sever the colonies in two, strangle their communication, and provide the British with a base of operations that would tip the balance of the war. New York City in 1776 was a bustling port, a melting pot of cultures and loyalties. It was a city divided, home to both fervent patriots and loyalists who clung tightly to their allegiance to the crown. The city's deep harbor made it an ideal point for British naval forces, and its position between New England and the southern colonies meant that whoever controlled New York could effectively control the colony's lifelines. General William Howe, commander of British forces in America, had a grand plan. He was a seasoned soldier, well-versed in European warfare, and his approach was methodical. With his brother, Admiral Lord Richard Howe, controlling a powerful fleet, the British prepared to land a massive force to retake New York and deliver a decisive blow to the rebellion. On July 2, 1776, as the newly minted Declaration of Independence was enshrined in Philadelphia, British ships gathered in New York Harbor, bristling with soldiers and cannons. Over 32,000 troops awaited their orders, the largest force the British had ever sent to America. Their mission was clear: seize New York, crush the Continental Army, and restore British rule. General George Washington, newly appointed commander-in-chief of the Continental Army, understood the gravity of the moment. His army was ill-equipped, poorly trained, and deeply outnumbered. The men were a mixture of farmers, laborers, and tradesmen, patriots fueled by conviction but lacking in experience. Washington knew that the coming battle would test not only his leadership but the very survival of the revolutionary cause. In late August 1776, British forces landed on Staten Island and Long Island, positioning themselves to outflank and encircle the American defenses. The Continental Army hastily established defensive positions on Brooklyn Heights, overlooking the East River and guarding the approaches to Manhattan. The Battle of Long Island, also known as the Battle of Brooklyn, began on August 27, 1776. What followed was one of the largest engagements of the war and a severe trial for the fledgling American forces. General Howe's plan was cunning and ruthless. While British troops launched a frontal assault on the American positions, a significant force executed a wide flanking maneuver, sneaking through dense forests and hills to cut off the American retreat. The colonists were caught off guard. For hours, the battle raged. American troops fought bravely, firing volleys that decimated advancing British ranks. The cry, "Don't fire until you see the whites of their eyes," rang out, a desperate attempt to conserve precious ammunition. Yet, despite their courage, the colonists were overwhelmed. The British lines pressed forward relentlessly, driving the Americans back. Panic began to spread. Units became disorganized, and many soldiers fled or were captured. Washington's command teetered on the brink of disaster, with the enemy closing in and the army's position compromised. Washington faced a dire decision: fight to the last man or attempt a risky retreat. Over the nights of August 29th and 30th, in a masterstroke of leadership and stealth, Washington orchestrated the evacuation of his army across the East River. Under cover of darkness and thick fog, boats ferried thousands of soldiers, horses, and supplies from Brooklyn to Manhattan. The operation was fraught with peril. Any noise or discovery could have led to a massacre. But the withdrawal succeeded almost miraculously, without alerting the British. When dawn broke on August 31st, the British found empty American camps. The Continental Army had escaped. New York City soon fell into British hands, becoming the principal base of operations for the empire in North America. The occupation was harsh and calculated. Loyalists returned to prominence, while patriots faced persecution and hardship. The city, once a symbol of colonial defiance, was transformed into a bastion of British power. But the loss of New York was a devastating blow to the revolutionaries. Morale plummeted, and the army, stretched thin and weary, was forced to retreat. Across New Jersey, Washington's forces dwindled as enlistments expired and desertions increased. Many believed the rebellion was doomed. Yet, Washington refused to surrender. Recognizing that the war was as much about endurance and spirit as battlefield victories, he began to rebuild his forces, bolstering discipline and rallying the hope of a weary people. In December 1776, Washington made a bold gamble. On Christmas night, he led his troops across the icy Delaware River, launching a surprise attack against the Hessian mercenaries stationed at Trenton. The victory was swift and decisive, reinvigorating the revolutionary cause and demonstrating that the Continental Army could strike back against the might of the British Empire. The British strike back with overwhelming force, seizing New York and forcing Washington's army into retreat. But in that winter campaign, Washington proved that survival and resilience were as vital as any battlefield win. The empire's power was vast, but the spirit of revolution burned fiercer still. This chapter of the war was one of hardship and determination, of a leader forging his army in the crucible of defeat, and of a people clinging to the hope of liberty against all odds. The empire had struck back with brutal might, but the revolution was far from over. Chapter 14. Crossing the Delaware. The winter of 1776 was cruel, not only in temperature, but in spirit. Cold winds swept through the valleys of Pennsylvania and across the battered camps of General George Washington's army. Defeat hung in the air like frost. The once burning hope of the Revolution had dimmed to embers, and the future of American independence teetered on the edge of collapse. The British Empire, flush from its victory in New York, now controlled one of the most important cities in the colonies. Washington's army, after a series of retreats through New Jersey, was broken in body and morale. The Continental Congress had fled Philadelphia in fear of British occupation. Desertion was rising. By the day, supplies were scarce. Shoes and coats were luxuries. And many of the soldiers, cold, hungry, unpaid, were days away from their enlistments expiring. The army, like the cause, was unraveling. But Washington did not yield. Where others saw the gathering dark, he saw one final flicker of light. A chance, a narrow and dangerous one, to turn the tide. He knew that another retreat might kill the revolution, not in battle, but in spirit. What he needed now was not a grand campaign, but a bold stroke, a symbolic and strategic strike that would remind the world, and his own countrymen, that the fight for liberty was still alive. The target was Trenton, New Jersey. The small town was occupied by roughly 1,400 Hessian soldiers, German mercenaries hired by the British to crush the rebellion. They were seasoned fighters, feared for their discipline and brutality. But they were also isolated, unaware, and it was Christmas. Washington believed that a surprise attack on Trenton could achieve something far more potent than military gain. It could restore belief. The plan was as ambitious as it was perilous. On the night of December 25, 1776, while the world celebrated Christmas and most assumed that winter would halt the fighting, Washington would lead his troops across the ice-choked Delaware River. Then, under the cover of darkness and storm, they would march 9 miles to Trenton and strike at dawn. The army began its crossing just as sleet and snow began to fall. It was not a silent night. Men wrapped themselves in threadbare blankets, teeth chattering as they loaded onto flat-bottomed boats. Ice cracked beneath them. The Delaware, swollen and angry from winter storms, threatened to pull them under with every push of the oars. Artillery had to be ferried across. Horses loaded. Entire regiments moved. Nearly 2,400 men, many barefoot. All exhausted. The current was fierce. It took hours. Time slipped away, and soon it was clear. They would not reach Trenton by dawn. But Washington pressed on. At 4 in the morning, in the freezing dark, the army began its march toward Trenton. The wind howled. Ice cut at the skin. Men stumbled. Muskets were damp, powder unreliable. Some fell behind. But still they moved, silent, cold, determined. As they neared Trenton, they divided into two columns to approach the town from different angles. At approximately 8 o'clock in the morning, they struck. The Hessians, still groggy from the night's festivities, were caught entirely off guard. Drums thundered through the streets. American cannons opened fire from the hilltops. Washington rode at the front, his voice rising above the smoke and chaos, rallying his men. House by house, street by street, the Hessians tried to form ranks, but it was too late. Within 45 minutes, the garrison collapsed. Over 900 Hessians were captured. Dozens more lay dead or wounded. American casualties were light. Only 2 men killed in the fighting, though others would later freeze to death in the aftermath. It was not a large battle in scale, but its impact was immeasurable. For the first time in months, the American people tasted victory. Newspapers rushed to print the news. The defeat of the feared Hessians gave the revolution a new life. Washington's leadership, once questioned, was now praised as audacious and brilliant. It was a moment of rebirth. Soldiers, newly inspired, re-enlisted. Volunteers came forward. France and other nations, watching the revolution from afar, saw that the Americans would not surrender easily. The British, who believed the rebellion was all but finished, were forced to reconsider, but the story of Trenton did not end there. Emboldened by the victory, Washington struck again. Just days later, on January 3, 1777, he defeated a British force at the Battle of Princeton, further eroding the enemy's grip on New Jersey and driving them back toward New Brunswick. Within 10 days, the campaign that began with despair had transformed the war's narrative. It had proven that the Continental Army, even in its darkest hour, could fight and win, and it had shown the world that the revolution, far from dying in the snow, had been reborn in it. The image of Washington, standing at the prow of a boat crossing the icy Delaware, would become legend, not just because of what happened that night, but because of what it meant: courage, sacrifice, resolved out on that bitter Christmas night. As snow fell on the Black River and wind lashed the faces of freezing men, history turned its course. A ragged army, barely holding together, had defied an empire, not with overwhelming power, but with sheer determination. The crossing of the Delaware was more than a military maneuver. It was a declaration, written not with ink, but with footsteps in the snow and blood on frozen ground. A declaration that liberty was worth the price. And from that frozen shore, the revolution marched on. Chapter 15. The Winter at Valley Forge. In the late months of 1777, the wind sharpened over the hills of Pennsylvania, ushering in a winter that would become legend, not because of triumphs on the battlefield, but because of suffering, endurance, and transformation. The American Revolution had entered a long and bitter phase, and at a quiet encampment west of Philadelphia, an army of tired, barefoot men braced itself against the cold and against despair. Valley Forge. The name would one day become sacred. In the American story, a symbol of perseverance when all seemed lost. But in that moment, December 1777, it was merely a stretch of bleak farmland and forest, a place chosen by General George Washington for its proximity to the enemy-held city of Philadelphia and its natural defensive terrain. It was not a fortress. It was not even shelter. It was a place to survive the winter. If they could, the Continental Army arrived weary, demoralized, and fractured. They had just endured the devastating defeats at Brandywine and Germantown, failing to stop British forces from capturing Philadelphia, the de facto capital of the rebellion. Congress had fled the city. The British wintered in comfort, warmed by fires and stocked provisions. But Washington and his men made camp among barren trees and frostbitten earth. There were no barracks, no supplies, no firewood, no shoes. That winter, nearly 12,000 soldiers made their way to Valley Forge. Most were farmers, craftsmen, and laborers who had left behind families and fields to fight for liberty. But what greeted them at the camp was not the glory of independence. It was hunger, exposure, and death. They built their own huts, one by one, log by log. Tools were scarce, and many soldiers had never swung an axe in their lives. Yet through freezing rain and snow, they worked. They built walls of mud and timber, floors of packed dirt, roofs that often leaked. Inside, they huddled together for warmth. 6 to 12 men in each hut, lying side by side, sharing tattered blankets. The food supply dwindled. There were weeks when only fire cakes, mixtures of flour and water cooked on open fires, were available. The scent of roasting meat never touched their camp. Salted pork and fresh bread were rare, and when they did arrive, they were often moldy or infested. Hunger gnawed at every man. For some, the snow was stained not just by blood, but by the prints of bare feet pressed into the ice. Disease stalked the camp like a phantom. Typhoid, dysentery, pneumonia, smallpox. Men grew weaker. Each day, there were no antibiotics, no proper hospitals. Surgeons amputated frostbitten limbs with saws dulled from overuse. Groans of pain drifted on the cold air, while wagons carried away the dead. By the end of the winter, nearly 2,000 soldiers would die at Valley Forge, not from bullets, but from exposure, starvation, and sickness. And yet, they stayed. They could have deserted. They could have walked away from the cause and returned to what homes remained. But they didn't. They stayed. Because of something stronger than hunger. They stayed because of belief, however battered, in the promise of liberty. And because at the center of their suffering stood a man who would not abandon them. General George Washington, tall, solemn, resolute, walked among the men. He did not hide in comfort. He lived as they lived, shared their misery, and listened to their pleas. He rode along the frozen paths, cloaked in silence, his heart breaking for every soldier he could not feed, for every hut he could not warm. But he did not show weakness. He offered his presence, his steadiness, his resolve that he wrote letters constantly, pleading with Congress for aid, for clothing, for food. But bureaucracy moved slowly, and politics moved even slower. Some in Congress questioned his leadership. Others plotted against him. Still, he remained, unyielding, watching his army hang by a thread. But Valley Forge was not only a place of suffering. It was a crucible, because in the heart of that winter, something extraordinary began to happen. In February 1778, a new figure arrived at camp, a barrel-chested, eccentric Prussian military officer named Baron Friedrich Wilhelm von Steuben. He spoke little English, carried no noble titles, and was armed only with a forged resume, a sharp eye, and an unbreakable will. But what von Steuben brought to Valley Forge was exactly what the army needed: discipline, structure, transformation. He began with a model company, teaching them proper drills, formations, and maneuvers. He emphasized cleanliness, order, and efficiency. He rewrote the Army's training manual from scratch, drilling men in the bitter cold, barking instructions, gesturing wildly when English failed him. And the soldiers responded. At first, they laughed. Then they listened. And then they changed. Men who had never held a musket properly learned to load and fire in disciplined volleys. Regiments moved as one. Morale, though still fragile, began to rise. Even the sick and wounded watched with new hope as the army reshaped itself, not into a band of farmers, but into a force by spring. The transformation was undeniable. What had entered Valley Forge as a broken army was emerging as a disciplined machine. The suffering had not ended, but it had been given purpose. From across the Atlantic, more news arrived. France, impressed by the resolve of the Americans and encouraged by the recent victory at Saratoga, had formally allied with the colonies. French ships and soldiers would soon join the fight. The revolution had a new breath. It would no longer be fought alone. On June 19, 1778, exactly 6 months after they had arrived, Washington and his army marched out of Valley Forge. They did not do so in defeat. They did not slink away in shame. They marched with heads high, muskets polished, banners raised. They marched like soldiers of a nation reborn. Valley Forge was not a battlefield in the traditional sense. No cannons thundered, no redcoats charged. But it was one of the most important victories of the war. It was a battle against despair, against cold, against death. It was where the revolution nearly died, and where, through sheer will, it came back stronger. Washington had kept his army alive. Von Steuben had turned it into a weapon. And the soldiers, those anonymous heroes whose names history may never know, had endured the unendurable, in the silence of snow and wind, amid smoke rising from log chimneys and the sound of coughing. In the night, freedom had found its proving ground, and when spring came to Valley Forge, it did not bring an end. It brought a beginning, a rebirth, a promise that liberty, though bloodied and shivering, would not surrender. Not here. Not now. Not ever. Chapter 16. The Saratoga Miracle. The year was 1777. And though the American Revolution had ignited hearts and stirred rebellion, the fires of hope were dimming under the cold weight of British might. The defeat in New York had left Washington's army battered. The British controlled key cities. Loyalist sentiment still simmered beneath the surface. And beyond the Atlantic, the world watched, but hesitated. Europe had little reason to wager blood and coin on a cause that seemed destined to collapse. But then came Saratoga, a place few outside the colonies had heard of, a campaign that would alter the fate of nations, and a miracle that would change the course of the war. The British strategy was bold and ambitious. General John Burgoyne, a proud and fashionable officer known as Gentleman Johnny, led a force of nearly 8,000 men southward from Canada. His mission was clear: seize the Hudson River Valley and sever New England from the other colonies. By cutting the rebellion in two, the British believed they could smother the uprising with precision. From the north, Burgoyne would march down through the dense forests of New York. General William Howe was expected to move northward from New York City, and Colonel Barry Street Ledger, with a smaller force, would push in from the west. Three arms of the same body, three jaws of the same trap. On parchment, the plan was perfect. On the map, it looked inevitable. But war does not follow plans, and maps are silent on the truth of terrain, of weather, of will. Burgoyne's army moved slowly. The wilderness was unkind. Dense forests, muddy roads, and sabotaged bridges slowed the advance. American militias, ragged but relentless, cut down trees to block the roads, ambushed supply lines, and vanished into the woods. And still, Burgoyne pressed on. He was confident. Arrogant, some would say. He brought with him not just soldiers, but officers' wives, servants, and a train of wagons filled with fine china, wine, and tailored uniforms. He believed this would be a swift campaign, a march of superiority. He believed the colonists would scatter before British steel, but at every step, the land pushed back. And so did the people. In late July, Burgoyne's army captured Fort Ticonderoga. Spirits rose in London. But the victory came at a cost. His supply line grew thin, and his need for provisions grew desperate. He sent a detachment of troops to Bennington, Vermont, hoping to seize food, horses, and Loyalist support. Instead, they were met by a swarm of angry farmers, militiamen, and frontiersmen under the fiery command of General John Stark. "There are your enemies," Stark told his men. "They are ours, or this night Molly Stark sleeps a widow." And, with that, the Americans attacked. The Battle of Bennington was a disaster for the British. Hundreds of men were killed or captured. It was a brutal awakening. The colonists were not running. They were fighting. Meanwhile, the Americans were rallying. Under the command of General Horatio Gates, a growing force of Continental regulars and militia gathered near Saratoga. Gates was cautious, steady, but alongside him rode a man of fire, General Benedict Arnold, reckless, brave, and burning with ambition. As Burgoyne neared Saratoga, he was no longer marching. He was crawling. His army was tired, hungry, and isolated. St. Ledger had been driven back in the west. Howe had never marched north at all, choosing instead to capture Philadelphia. Burgoyne was alone. Still, he attacked. the first major engagement, came on September 19, 1777, at Freeman's Farm. It was a bitter, close-fought battle. British bayonets clashed with American rifles. Trees exploded with musket fire. Smoke clouded the field. At day's end, the British held the ground, but at a staggering cost. Nearly 600 men had fallen. For a victory, it felt more like a warning. Burgoyne dug in, waiting for reinforcements that would never come. The Americans grew stronger by the day. Reinforcements poured in. Supplies arrived. Morale surged. What began as a patchwork of militias now stood as a hardened wall. Then came October 7 at the Battle of Bemis Heights. Burgoyne launched another assault, desperate to break the American line. But the Americans were ready. And Benedict Arnold, though technically relieved of command after quarreling with Gates, refused to sit idle. Mounted on horseback, fury in his voice, Arnold charged into battle. He led his men through the smoke, across the fields, over barricades. His courage was electrifying, igniting the soldiers around him. They overran the British defenses, captured key positions, and drove Burgoyne's men into retreat. Arnold was wounded, his leg shattered by a musket ball, but his charge had turned the tide. He had led from the front, and the men followed point 10 days later, surrounded and hopeless. Burgoyne surrendered on October 17, 1777. The British laid down their arms. Nearly 6,000 soldiers captured. An entire British army taken. It was the first major, undeniable, strategic victory for the Americans. And it echoed far beyond the hills of New York, because in the salons of Paris, in the courts of Versailles, and in the war rooms of Europe, the world took notice. France, long a rival of Britain, had watched the revolution with interest but caution. But Saratoga changed everything. It proved the Americans could win, that the cause was not a passing rebellion, but a real war. A war worth backing. In February 1778, France officially recognized the United States of America and entered the war. It was the miracle Washington had prayed for. French ships would soon challenge British naval supremacy. French troops would arrive to fight alongside the Continentals. Diplomats rejoiced. Congress exhaled. And King George III realized, for the first time, that this war would not be easy, that this was no simple rebellion. This was a revolution. Saratoga had turned the world upside down. And yet, for all its grand consequences, the miracle of Saratoga was born from grit, of farmers who stood their ground, of commanders who clashed and rallied, of an army that grew stronger instead of weaker. It was born from the trees, the mud, the hunger, and from the refusal to quit. In the smoky woods of northern New York, the dream of liberty had found a shield. And with France at their side, the patriots now stood taller. But this war was far from over. The British would rage with new fury. The colonies would be tested again and again. But after Saratoga, the revolution had something it had never truly known before: momentum, and the world would never see the American cause the same way again. Chapter 17. Red and Blue. The Global War. By the spring of 1778, the flames of revolution had leapt beyond the borders of the American colonies. What had begun as a localized rebellion, fought in forests and fields between colonists and redcoats, had become something far greater, far more dangerous. It was no longer simply a struggle between Britain and its former colonies. It had become a global war, and the world was watching. The American victory at Saratoga had shaken old empires. It was not merely a battlefield triumph. It was a signal, a flare rising into the skies of Europe, calling to every kingdom that had ever suffered under the shadow of British power. The French had seen their opportunity, but they would not be the only ones to answer that call. The blue of the Continental Army now stood alongside the blue and white of France, the gold of Spain, and soon, the orange of the Dutch Republic. Across oceans, across continents, the struggle for American independence was transforming the politics and militaries of the 18th century world. In Versailles, France's King Louis XVI made a bold and dangerous decision. On February 6, 1778, he signed a treaty of alliance with the United States of America, recognizing the new nation and pledging military and naval support against Great Britain. This was not a token gesture. France brought with it an armada, an army, and the kind of resources the Americans had desperately lacked. But it also brought consequences. To Britain, this was a provocation beyond all toleration. They had not simply lost a colony. They now faced the full might of their oldest enemy. The red coats of British infantry would now be matched by the blue coats of French Marines. The war that had begun in Lexington and Concord would now be fought in the Caribbean, in the Mediterranean, in West Africa, and in the far reaches of the Indian Ocean. This was no longer rebellion. This was World War. France wasted no time. Under the command of Admiral Charles Hector, the Comte d'Estaing, a French fleet sailed for North America. Though plagued by storms and miscommunication, the very presence of French ships in American waters changed the balance of power. British fleets, once dominant along the coast, were forced to divert resources, fortify ports, and anticipate attacks from every direction. But France was not the only power eager to challenge Britain's supremacy. Spain, though initially cautious, entered the war in 1779, not as an ally to the Americans, but as an ally to France. Spain had its own scores to settle, its own empires to reclaim. The loss of Florida, the humiliation of previous wars. Now, with Britain distracted, Spain saw a chance to strike. Under the leadership of Bernardo de Galvez, the Spanish launched campaigns along the Gulf Coast, capturing key British forts in Baton Rouge, Mobile, and Pensacola. They cut deep into British holdings in West Florida, threatening British supply lines in the South. Galvez became a hero, his name etched into cities, his actions largely forgotten in textbooks, but vital to the war's outcome. In Europe, Spain and France launched coordinated naval strikes against British ports and convoys. The English Channel, once a moat of protection, now bristled with enemy sails. British merchants feared to cross the sea. Insurance rates skyrocketed. The economy wavered. In the Caribbean, warships clashed over the Sugar Islands, rich with profit and soaked in blood. Islands like St. Lucia, Grenada, and Jamaica became pawns in a game of empires. Fortresses rose from coral beaches. Cannons thundered beneath tropical sun. The warm waters turned red, but Britain still held one of the greatest naval forces the world had ever seen. The Royal Navy, vast and experienced, fought back with force. Blockades tightened. Supply routes were disrupted. Battles raged from the North Sea to the South Atlantic. Then came the Dutch. Though neutral at first, the Dutch Republic had long served as a vital trading partner for the Americans, smuggling arms, powder, and goods through Caribbean ports. Britain grew increasingly frustrated. When the Dutch resisted British demands to end this trade, war erupted. In December 1780, Britain declared war on the Dutch Republic. The Fourth Anglo-Dutch War had begun. Now, another power had joined the fray. Dutch ships, though less mighty than Britain's, fought with courage and resilience. Their ports were attacked, colonies captured, but their commitment to defying British pressure helped strain the empire even further. By 1781, Britain was fighting on 5 continents. In North America, the war had dragged on, brutal and inconclusive. But now, British commanders had to divert soldiers to the West Indies, to Gibraltar, to India. Resources were stretched thin. Morale began to crack. The American war was never intended to be this costly. And yet, it had become the focal point of an international storm. But beyond politics and power, beyond admirals and alliances, were the lives of sailors and soldiers who bore the brunt of this global struggle. French ships, sleek and swift, crossed thousands of miles to join their American allies. On board were men from Marseille and Normandy, seasoned by war but awed by the dream of liberty. In the Caribbean, African slaves were pressed into service, fighting wars they did not choose, under flags they did not serve. On Dutch merchant ships, young boys climbed rigging under cannon fire, trading trade routes for battles. Even the Indian Ocean felt the echo. French Admiral Pierre Suffren, brilliant and unpredictable, challenged British fleets along the coasts of India. Colonial outposts erupted in gunfire. Traitors became prisoners. Forts were bombarded. The sun never set on this war. And through it all, in Congress and Parliament, voices rose and clashed. Some urged peace. Others demanded escalation. In London, whispers of exhaustion grew louder. The war had become a bleeding wound. In France, the cost was immense, but the prestige irresistible. Meanwhile, in America, the presence of French troops and ships brought not just muscle, but validation. They were no longer alone. Lafayette, the young French noble who had become like a son to Washington, rallied troops with eloquence and fire. French gold paid for supplies. French engineers built fortifications. French fleets would, eventually, help trap British forces on a final battlefield. The red of empire and the blue of revolution now clashed across every horizon. What had started as a cry for independence had become a test of global order. An empire, long dominant, was now cornered by a coalition of its enemies. The stakes had grown higher, the battles more vast, the outcomes less certain. And yet, even in this worldwide theater, the heart of the war still beat in the muddy fields and silent woods of North America, where farmers shouldered muskets, where generals gambled everything, and where the idea of liberty stood unshaken, even as the world burned. This was not just a colonial conflict. It was not a rebellion in the margins of an empire. It was a war that reshaped the globe, a war that pitted not just armies, but ideologies, power against principle, monarchy against revolution, control against freedom, and as navies battled across oceans and flags shifted over distant forts, the revolution crept closer to its climax. Its final act, still unwritten. The world had taken sides, and the fire of American independence now burned across continents. Chapter 18. Benedict Arnold's Betrayal. In every war, there are moments that inspire glory and moments that taste of ash. There are names that rise as legends and names that descend into infamy. The American Revolution had many heroes, but none fell from grace as spectacularly as Benedict Arnold. His name, once spoken with pride, would be twisted into a curse, a name no longer shouted on the battlefield, but whispered in disgust. And it would not be the British who brought him down. It would be his own choices, his ambition, his wounds, visible and invisible. He had once been the Revolution's brightest fire. Benedict Arnold of Connecticut had risked everything in the early days of the war. He had been among the first to answer the call to arms. Bold, aggressive, charismatic, he earned the admiration of troops and officers alike. In 1775, he marched through the Canadian wilderness in a brutal campaign to seize Quebec, enduring starvation, frostbite, and treacherous terrain. Though the mission failed, his leadership was undeniable. He fought at Ridgefield, at Valcour Island, and most famously, at Saratoga, where he defied orders, charged into battle, and turned the tide. He was reckless, but effective. As he bled from a shattered leg at Saratoga, many whispered that he had saved the day. He had fought not just the British, but pride, politics, and his own commanding officer, Horatio Gates. But valor does not guarantee favor. As others were promoted around him, Arnold grew embittered. He watched as men he considered lesser were rewarded. Congress delayed his commissions. Gossip darkened his name. And while he recovered from his injuries, he sank deeper into resentment. In 1778, Washington, still loyal to Arnold, appointed him military commander of Philadelphia. It was a city recently evacuated by the British, brimming with political tension and suspicious loyalties. There, Arnold found no peace, only scandal. He lived lavishly, far beyond his means. He surrounded himself with Loyalists, and it was there that he met the woman who would change the course of his life, Margaret Peggy Shippen. Beautiful, charming, and from a wealthy Loyalist family, Peggy was barely 18 when she caught Arnold's eye. She had once courted British Major John Andre, an officer known for his wit, his manners, and his deep ties to the British command. Whether through love, manipulation, or shared ambition, Peggy soon became more than Arnold's bride. she became. His link to treason. By 1779, Arnold had reached his breaking point. He was drowning in debt, embattled in court-martial hearings, and consumed by bitterness. The revolution, which had once burned in his blood, now seemed thankless, forgotten. And so, he made a choice. In secret, Arnold reached out to the British. Through coded letters and invisible ink, he began a correspondence with Major Andre. Using Peggy as a courier, they devised a plan that, if successful, could have crippled the revolution. Arnold offered to deliver West Point. It was not just any outpost. It was the linchpin of the Hudson River. Whoever held it controlled the artery between New England and the rest of the colonies. Arnold, now appointed commander of West Point, used his authority to quietly weaken its defenses. He delayed repairs. He scattered supplies. And in return, he asked for gold, and a British commission. It was betrayal, cold and calculated. On September 21st, 1780, Arnold met Major Andre in person, under cover of darkness, near the banks of the Hudson. There, he handed over sensitive documents, maps, plans, garrison strength. Andre tucked them into his boot, mounted his horse, and began his journey back to British lines. But fate is rarely predictable. Andre never made it. 3 American militiamen, dressed in rough clothes and acting on instinct, stopped him near Tarrytown. Andre tried to bluff. He said he was a traveler, a civilian. But the papers were found. He was arrested. The plot, nearly complete, collapsed. Word reached Arnold before it reached Washington. He was dining with guests, including the very man he planned to betray. As messengers approached with the news, Arnold excused himself, kissed his sleeping wife, and escaped through a back door. He rowed hard to the river, boarded a British sloop waiting in secret, and fled to safety, leaving behind chaos, disgrace, and his name. Major Andre was not so fortunate. Washington, heartbroken and furious, ordered a military tribunal. Andre, though charming and beloved even by his captors, was found guilty of espionage. He pleaded for a soldier's death by firing squad. But the law was cleared. He was hanged as a spy on October 2nd, 1780. His death was mourned by both sides. Arnold, by contrast, was reviled. News of the betrayal stunned the colonies. Soldiers wept with rage. Children were taught to despise his name. George Washington, who had once considered Arnold a brother in arms, was shaken. He had trusted him, defended him, elevated him, and in return, Arnold had tried to sell out the revolution itself. He was given his British commission. He served under General Cornwallis. He led raids in Virginia, burning towns and pillaging stores. But he was never fully embraced by the British. They respected his cunning, but despised his treachery. After the war, Arnold moved to England. He lived the rest of his life haunted by whispers, avoided by former allies, and never truly welcomed by new ones. He died in 1801. Bitter, forgotten, alone, but his legacy did not die with him. Benedict Arnold's name became a wound carved into American memory, not because he failed, but because he had once been so great. His betrayal was not the fall of a coward, but of a hero who turned. And that, more than anything, frightened the revolution, because it reminded them that the enemy was not only across the sea. Sometimes, he was one of their own. Yet, in a strange way, Arnold's treason also galvanized the cause. It reminded the patriots of what they stood to lose. It ignited fury. It renewed purpose. And it reinforced the one truth that would carry them to victory, that liberty could never be bought. Not for gold, not for rank, not for comfort. The revolution was not perfect. It was made by flawed men, stitched together by hope and pain. But it endured, even through betrayal. And in that endurance, it triumphed. When the story of Benedict Arnold is told, it is not just the tale of a traitor. It is the warning of what happens when honor is abandoned and a testament to a cause that survived even the darkest of betrayals. Chapter 19, Southern Flames. By the closing months of 1778, the war that had been burning along the northern seaboard, through the frosted hills of Saratoga, the shadowed forests of New York, and the frozen desperation of Valley Forge now shifted its weight. The gaze of the British Empire turned south, toward Georgia, toward the Carolinas, toward the plantations, the swamps, and the rice fields where cotton grew thick and loyalty was muddied. It was not a sudden change, but a calculated one that Britain's strategy had stalled in the north. Cities had been captured, New York held, but the countryside remained elusive. The Americans did not collapse. They adapted, and every British mile won was matched by months of resistance, ambush, and attrition. Parliament began to thirst for a decisive blow, one that would break the rebellion's spine. And so, in London's war rooms, a new plan took shape. The southern colonies, they believed, would be different than in the south. Loyalist sentiment was thought to be strong. British commanders promised Parliament that vast swaths of the population, Scots-Irish settlers, wealthy landowners, and Anglican loyalists, would rise to welcome the redcoats. All they needed was the spark, a show of force, a restored order. The rebellion would crumble from the bottom. They were wrong. The fire that awaited them was not one of submission, but of vengeance. In December of 1778, British forces under Lieutenant Colonel Archibald Campbell invaded Georgia. Within days, they captured Savannah. The port fell with little resistance. The city's loyalist factions cheered in the streets. And for a moment, it seemed the plan was working. British commanders declared Georgia restored to the crown. A string of military victories followed, but shadows crept behind every pine. The countryside did not yield. In 1779, a Franco-American force attempted to retake Savannah. French troops under the Comte d'Estaing joined with American militiamen in a rare joint siege. They laid cannons in the marshes, drove trenches toward the walls. But in October, a bloody and disastrous assault failed. Over 800 men were killed or wounded in mere hours. Among them, Count Casimir Pulaski, the Polish hero of the Revolution, mortally wounded by grapeshot. The siege broke. The city held, and so the war burned deeper inland. In 1780, British General Henry Clinton launched a full-scale invasion of South Carolina. With over 8,000 men, he besieged Charleston. The city held out for 6 weeks, but hunger, disease, and isolation wore down its defenses. On May 12th, the largest American surrender of the war occurred. Over 5,000 troops laid down their arms. Clinton, triumphant, returned to New York, leaving Lord Cornwallis in charge of the Southern theater. The British believed the South was won, but they had underestimated the soul of the backcountry, in the hills and hollows of the Carolinas. The war took a different form. It was not rows of muskets on open fields. It was men in hunting shirts and coonskin caps, hiding in forests, emerging from the mist. Partisan fighters, local militias, farmers turned soldiers, sometimes overnight, and they fought not just against the British, but against their neighbors. This was civil war. Brutal, personal, a war of house to house, kin against kin. Loyalist militias clashed with patriot bands. Homes were burned, families scattered. Retaliation followed retaliation. It was not always a war of flags, but of vengeance, of memory. A fear. One name would become legend in this shadowed conflict. Francis Marion, the Swamp Fox. A small, wiry man from South Carolina, Marion led a band of guerrilla fighters through the swamps and pine forests. They moved like smoke, appearing without warning, striking quickly, and vanishing before British cavalry could respond. They sabotaged bridges, ambushed supply trains, and melted into the night. Cornwallis hated him. He ordered entire regions punished for harboring Marion's men. Plantations were torched. Civilians were interrogated. But the more the British cracked down, the more resistance grew. Marion was not alone. Figures like Thomas Sumter, the Gamecock, and Andrew Pickens waged their own brutal campaigns. Meanwhile, the British began to stretch thin. They advanced deep into the interior, but their supply lines weakened. The terrain was unfamiliar, the heat unforgiving. Local support was less enthusiastic than promised. Patriots struck from the trees. then disappeared across rivers. In August of 1780, Cornwallis sent General Charles Lord Rawdon and Colonel Banastre Tarleton to hunt and destroy. The rebels, Tarleton, young and ruthless, became infamous. At the Battle of Waxhaws, his dragoons slaughtered surrendering American troops, refusing quarter. Survivors spoke of the carnage in whispers. Tarleton's quarter, they said, meaning none. It sparked a fury across the South. In response, men who had once hesitated now took up arms. One of the most pivotal moments came not from the Continental Army, but from frontiersmen at Kings Mountain. On October 7, 1780, the tide began to turn. A British force of over 1,000 Loyalists, commanded by Major Patrick Ferguson, took up position on a rocky ridge near the North Carolina border. Ferguson believed himself untouchable. His men were well-armed, well-positioned. But he underestimated the fury of the men riding toward him. From the highlands of Virginia, the valleys of Tennessee, and the Carolinas, over 900 over-mountain men gathered, rough frontiersmen with long rifles and vengeance in their hearts. They climbed the mountain from all sides, surrounding the Loyalists. The battle lasted barely an hour. Ferguson was killed, his body pierced by 7 bullets. The Loyalists broke. Few escaped. It was a slaughter and a message, the British. Southern strategy was unraveling. In the aftermath, Cornwallis halted his advance. He withdrew into South Carolina, regrouping, lashing out at the growing rebellion with increasing brutality. But the partisan war continued. No village was safe. No road unguarded. No soldier certain of his allies. Meanwhile, a new American general arrived in the South, Nathanael Greene. Soft-spoken, intellectual, and strategic, Greene had been one of Washington's most trusted commanders. Now he faced the impossible, rebuilding a shattered Southern army. He did not try to defeat Cornwallis directly. Instead, he split his forces, forcing the British to chase ghosts across vast distances. It worked. Greene wore them down, step by step. At Cowpens in January 1781, General Daniel Morgan defeated Tarleton in a brilliant double envelopment. Tarleton's force was destroyed, over 800 casualties. His reputation, once terrifying, now cracked. Cornwallis, enraged, chased Greene across North Carolina, through rivers, forests, and swamps. At Guilford Courthouse in March, the armies clashed in a furious battle. Though the British technically won, the cost was devastating. Over 500 redcoats lay dead or wounded. Cornwallis, with his army bleeding, limped toward Virginia. The South was no longer a safe beat. It was a crucible of pain, a forge of fury, and it was reshaping the war itself. The British dream of Southern loyalty had become a nightmare. Every hill concealed an enemy. Every farmhouse hid a rifle. And even the cities, once seen as bastions of control, now bristled with quiet rebellion. For the people of the South, black, white, free, enslaved, the war was personal. Families were torn apart. Plantations burned. Communities fractured. Enslaved Africans seized the chaos to escape, to fight, to resist. Some joined British forces in exchange for promises of freedom. Others fled into the wilderness. The war brought, not clarity, but chaos. By 1781, the British were exhausted. Their empire, stretched across the globe, was cracking. Their army, trapped in a hostile land, was bleeding. And their commanders, once so confident, now whispered of retreat. The flames that had consumed the Carolinas now lit the path to Virginia. Cornwallis, desperate to end the war, marched toward Yorktown. He did not know it yet, but he was walking into history, and the Southern flames, burning wild, bitter, and bright, had lit the road to the end. Chapter 20: Swamp Fox and the Ghosts. In the dense, tangled wilderness of South Carolina's low country, where moss-draped cypress trees stood like sentinels over slow-moving rivers and shadowed swamps, a different kind of war was being waged. This was not the orderly, line-and-column combat of European tradition. It was a silent war, fought in whispers, shadows, and sudden flashes of gunfire. It was a war of ghosts, Among these spectral fighters, none became more legendary than Francis Marion, a man who would be known for generations as the Swamp Fox. His name was whispered with a mixture of awe and frustration by friend and foe alike. To the British, he was a ghost haunting their every movement, a phantom that could not be caught, a fury that struck without warning and vanished without trace. To the patriots, he was a symbol of hope, the embodiment of a people's fierce determination to resist no matter the odds. Born in 1732 in Berkeley County, South Carolina, Francis Marion was a man forged in the frontier's rough and rugged fires. A planter by trade, he was also a soldier, a veteran of earlier conflicts like the French and Indian War. His experience in the wilderness, his intimate knowledge of the swamps and rivers, became invaluable when the Revolution turned to the Southern Theater in early 1780. Following the British capture of Charleston and the defeat of American forces there, the southern colonies were in peril. British control seemed unshakable. Yet, beneath the surface, pockets of resistance, often led by men like Marion, refused to surrender. Marion's band was small. At times, just a few dozen men. But their impact was outsized. Their tactics were unlike the conventional warfare that dominated much of the conflict. They were guerrillas, using the land itself as a weapon. They moved silently through swamps, used rivers for escape, and struck when least expected. His men were farmers, hunters, backwoodsmen, ordinary citizens turned warriors by necessity. They were experts with the rifle, sharpshooters who could pick off enemy soldiers from hundreds of yards away. They wore no uniform, carried no banners, and avoided large battles. Instead, they aimed to disrupt, demoralize, and exhaust the British. Marion's men became masters of surprise attacks, ambushes, and hit-and-run raids. They attacked supply lines, destroyed enemy forage parties, and struck at isolated outposts. The British never knew where or when the Swamp Fox would appear next. They found themselves chasing shadows in the mist. One particularly telling example occurred in the summer of 1780. Marion's small force, numbering less than 100, attacked a British outpost at Black Mingo Creek. The outnumbered British garrison was taken by surprise. In a swift, brutal assault, Marion's men overwhelmed the defenders, capturing prisoners and seizing supplies before disappearing into the swamp. This pattern repeated itself across the southern backcountry. British soldiers, frustrated and demoralized, grew to fear the invisible enemy lurking in the wilderness. The war was not just between armies but between the land and the invaders. The marshes and forests became battlegrounds where traditional tactics failed, but Marion's guerrilla war was not simply about military success. It was a psychological weapon. His raids sowed fear and confusion, undermining British authority and control. It gave hope to loyal patriots who refused to bow. His reputation grew until it became a legend, one that spread beyond the borders of South Carolina. Marion's nickname, Swamp Fox, was said to have been bestowed by British officers, frustrated by his ability to vanish into the swamp as if he were a ghost. They saw him as cunning, elusive, and relentless, a predator who understood the land better than any redcoat. Yet, Marion was not merely a shadow warrior. He was a man of conviction, leading a cause that went far beyond hit-and-run attacks. He understood the stakes, the survival of a people, the birth of a nation. His leadership inspired loyalty and courage. Even in the darkest hours, he worked closely with other patriot leaders like Thomas Sumter and Andrew Pickens, coordinating their efforts to create a network of resistance that choked British supply lines and communication. Together, these partisan leaders turned the southern backcountry into a quagmire for British forces. Marion's effectiveness came not only from his knowledge of the terrain, but from his ability to inspire his men. His troops were often poorly supplied, facing harsh conditions, yet they fought with fierce determination. Their bond was forged in hardship and shared purpose. The Swamp Fox used the land not just to hide, but as a weapon itself. Swamps were treacherous and dangerous, filled with alligators, snakes, and disease. Many would have shunned these places as impenetrable. Marion embraced them, understanding that the enemy would never expect an attack to come from such a forbidding place. One of the most famous moments of Marion's campaign was the raid on the British garrison at Yorktown. Under cover of darkness, Marion led his men through the swampy terrain, bypassing enemy patrols. They struck quickly, capturing supplies and prisoners, then melted away into the marshes. The raid was a psychological blow, a reminder that the British were vulnerable even in supposedly secure positions. Despite his guerrilla tactics, Marion understood the importance of discipline and organization. His men operated in small groups, but maintained strict control. Surprise and speed were their allies. Every raid was meticulously planned, and every man knew his role. That Marion's campaign was not without hardship. The swamps were brutal, mosquitoes bred disease, food was scarce, and the threat of British retaliation was constant. Many of his men were wounded or sick, yet they persisted, driven by a belief in their cause and the leadership of their commander. The British, for their part, recognized the threat but struggled to counter it. Their troops were trained for conventional warfare, ill-equipped to fight an enemy who refused open battle. Attempts to hunt down Marion's men often failed. The swamps were a labyrinth, and the swamp fox knew every hidden path. The broader impact of Marion's war extended beyond the battlefield. His actions disrupted British plans, tied down troops, and bought time for the Continental forces. His raids boosted patriot morale, demonstrating that resistance was possible even in the darkest times. Marion's guerrilla warfare was emblematic of a larger truth about the American Revolution. It was not just a war of armies, but a war of people. Ordinary citizens rose to challenge an empire, turning their homes, fields, and forests into battlegrounds. This shadow war in the South was a struggle of endurance and cunning, where survival depended on wit as much as firepower. It was a war fought not in the glare of sunlight, but in the shifting shadows of swamps and forests. In the end, this swamp fox and his band of guerrilla fighters left an indelible mark on the revolution. They proved that the fight for freedom was not just won by grand battles and sieges, but also by those who dared to fight in the shadows, who used the land itself as an ally. Francis Marion's legacy is one of resilience, ingenuity, and fierce independence. His war was not one of glory, but of survival, a testament to the power of the human spirit in the face of overwhelming odds. And as the Revolutionary War drew to a close, the stories of Marion and his ghosts would inspire generations to come, reminders that sometimes the most effective weapon is not the might of armies, but the courage of those who refuse to be captured or defeated. This swamp fox lived on, not just in history books, but in the very spirit of a nation forged in struggle, shadow, and hope. Chapter 21. Black Soldiers in a White Man's War. The American Revolutionary War, often remembered as a struggle for liberty and independence, was also, paradoxically, a conflict deeply entangled with the brutal institution of slavery. For African Americans, the war was a crucible of hope and heartbreak, opportunity and betrayal. It was a war within a war, a fight for freedom within a fight for a nation's future. Their stories, though often overshadowed by those of white commanders and soldiers, are essential to understanding the complex human tapestry of the Revolution. From the earliest days of conflict, African Americans found themselves caught between competing promises of emancipation and equality from both sides, yet frequently met with exclusion, exploitation, and erasure. Some fought for the British crown, others took up arms with the patriots. Each decision was deeply personal, shaped by circumstance, geography, and the urgent desire to escape the chains of slavery. Before the first shot was fired at Lexington and Concord, enslaved Africans in the colonies were watching and listening. They understood that the ideals proclaimed by revolutionaries, all men are created equal, clashed starkly with the daily reality of bondage. They hoped the upheaval might open doors to freedom long denied. Yet, freedom was a complicated promise, entangled with politics, military necessity, and racial prejudice. The British crown, ever eager to weaken the rebellious colonies, saw African Americans as a strategic resource. In November 1775, Lord Dunmore, the royal governor of Virginia, issued what became known as Dunmore's Proclamation. It promised freedom to any enslaved person who fled their patriot masters to join the British forces. This bold proclamation sent shockwaves through the southern colonies. Thousands of enslaved men and women risked everything, family separation, brutal retaliation, to answer this call. They became known as the Black Loyalists. Many served in labor roles, constructing fortifications, carrying supplies, or working as guides and spies. Some took up arms, fighting alongside British regulars in battles and skirmishes. However, the British promise was often precarious and unevenly honored. The path to freedom was littered with broken oaths and cruel betrayals. Some Black Loyalists found themselves abandoned or re-enslaved once the war ended, victims of shifting political priorities. Yet, for many, their loyalty earned them passage to resettlement in places like Nova Scotia or Sierra Leone, where they sought to build new lives free from bondage. Meanwhile, the Patriots faced their own dilemma. At the outset of the war, many colonial leaders were reluctant to arm African Americans. The fear of armed black men was pervasive, rooted in centuries of slavery and racial hierarchy. Yet, as the war dragged on and manpower dwindled, pragmatism prevailed that in 1777, the Continental Army began to accept free African American volunteers, and later, enslaved men were permitted to enlist with promises of freedom upon service. The Rhode Island Regiment, famously nicknamed the Black Regiment, became a notable example of black soldiers fighting for the patriot cause. These men faced peril on multiple fronts, enemy fire on the battlefield, and persistent discrimination within their own ranks. They often received lower pay, were assigned the most grueling tasks, and were excluded from honors given to white soldiers. Yet, despite these obstacles, black soldiers distinguished themselves through courage, skill, and unwavering commitment. The experience of African Americans in the war was not monolithic. In the South, where slavery was deeply entrenched, enslaved men sometimes escaped to join the British or Patriot forces. Some Native American tribes also enlisted black warriors, blending their struggles in complex alliances, but the war's promises were frequently hollow. After the Treaty of Paris in 1783 ended the conflict, African Americans, both Loyalists and Patriots, faced renewed uncertainty. Many found themselves abandoned by the governments they served. Enslaved men and women were returned to bondage, and those who had fought were denied the freedoms for which they had risked everything. In this paradox lies a painful truth. The American Revolution, for all its lofty ideals, did not end slavery. Instead, it sowed the seeds of a divided nation, one that would wrestle with the legacy of bondage for generations. Yet, amidst this tragedy, stories of heroism endure. The courage of black soldiers challenged prevailing notions of race and equality. Their contributions were vital to the Patriot victory, and their quest for freedom laid early groundwork for future struggles. Through abolition movements, civil rights battles, and beyond, the forgotten heroes of the Revolution are finally reclaiming their rightful place in history, not merely as footnotes, but as central actors in the nation's founding drama. Their fight was not just against the British crown, but against centuries of injustice. In the end, the story of black soldiers in the American Revolutionary War is a testament to resilience, courage, and an unyielding hope for liberty. It is a story that demands to be told, fully, honestly, and with the respect it deserves. Chapter 22. Women Behind the Lines. In the grand narratives of war, history often paints a picture dominated by generals, soldiers, and battles. Yet, beneath the roar of cannons and the clash of muskets lies a quieter, often overlooked story, a story of women. Women who, though barred from the ranks of official combatants, wove themselves into the very fabric of the American Revolution. They were spies, nurses, camp followers, and even combatants in disguise. Their courage, sacrifice, and unwavering Resolve became the invisible backbone of the revolutionary cause. The American Revolutionary War was not only fought on the battlefields but also in the kitchens, fields, and secret meeting places where women toiled tirelessly. These unsung heroines faced dangers that rivaled those of the men on the front lines. Their contributions were vital, yet their names were often buried beneath the weight of history's traditional narratives. Among these women, none embodies the spirit of the Revolution more vividly than Deborah Sampson. Born in Massachusetts in 1760, Deborah was a woman who refused to be confined by the strictures of her time. Determined to serve her fledgling country, she took the extraordinary step of disguising herself as a man. Under the name Robert Shirtliff, she enlisted in the Continental Army. For over a year, Deborah marched, drilled, and fought alongside her fellow soldiers. She endured the harsh realities of military life: cold, hunger, disease, and the constant threat of death. Twice wounded in battle, she concealed her identity with remarkable resolve, even tending to her injuries herself to avoid discovery. It was only after falling ill and receiving medical treatment that her secret was revealed. Deborah Sampson's story is not just one of individual bravery. It symbolizes the broader role women played in challenging societal norms to serve their country. Her service earned her a military pension, a rare acknowledgement for a woman of her time. While Deborah fought in the ranks, countless other women played equally vital roles behind the lines. They were the camp followers, wives, daughters, and sisters who accompanied the Continental Army. These women cooked, cleaned, nursed the wounded, and mended uniforms, often enduring the same brutal conditions as the soldiers. Their presence was essential to the Army's survival, providing comfort and support amidst the horrors of war. Molly Pitcher is one such figure whose name has become legend. Though the details of her life blend fact and folklore, her story captures the essence of female courage. During the Battle of Monmouth in 1778, Molly, believed to be Mary Ludwig Hayes, carried water to thirsty soldiers, earning her the nickname Molly Pitcher. When her husband, a cannon operator, collapsed, she took his place at the gun, firing at the enemy with steady determination. Molly Pitcher's actions became a symbol of women's active participation in the Revolution. Her courage inspired countless others, illustrating that bravery was not confined to the battlefield alone. Beyond those who took up arms or supported the Army directly, many women risked their lives as spies and informants. The war was as much about intelligence and secrecy as it was about open conflict, and women's ability to move unnoticed made them invaluable assets. Take the example of Anna Strong, a member of the Culper spy ring in New York. Under the watchful eyes of British troops, Anna devised a clever system using laundry hung on her clothesline to signal the movements of British ships. A handkerchief or a particular number of clothespins conveyed secret messages to American spies operating in the city. Her bravery and ingenuity helped maintain a vital flow of intelligence that influenced the course of the war. Similarly, Agent 355, an anonymous female spy whose true identity remains a mystery, played a critical role in uncovering British plots. Operating in the shadows, she gathered information that was pivotal to American successes. Her story reminds us that countless women risked their freedom and lives in the name of liberty. Women also managed households and farms in the absence of men. They sustained the economic lifeblood of the colonies, growing food, tending livestock, and keeping businesses running. This was no small feat in times of war when shortages and instability were rampant. Their resilience ensured that the revolutionary effort did not falter on the home front. The emotional toll on these women was profound. Letters from the period reveal the anxiety of waiting for news of loved ones, the grief of loss, and the determination to persevere. They lived with uncertainty and fear, yet their spirit remained unbroken. In some cases, women served as mediators and diplomats, leveraging social networks to influence opinions and gather support. Their salons and parlors became hubs of political discussion and planning, contributing to the intellectual underpinnings of the revolution. The contributions of Native American women and African American women also deserve recognition. While Native American tribes faced complex choices during the war, their women sustained communities through displacement and conflict, preserving cultural traditions under immense strain. African American women, whether free or enslaved, labored in countless ways, working as cooks, laundresses, nurses, and sometimes spies. Their efforts supported both Loyalist and patriot causes, often amidst the harshest conditions and greatest personal risks. Despite their indispensable roles, women's contributions were often marginalized in official records and post-war histories. Yet, their stories survive in diaries, letters, oral traditions, and local legends, waiting to be fully told and honored. The American Revolution's narrative is incomplete without these voices. Women behind the lines embodied the very essence of sacrifice and patriotism. They demonstrated that the fight for independence was not confined to muskets and cannons, but was also waged in kitchens, fields, and secret shadows. Their courage, creativity, and endurance were crucial to the birth of a nation, and their legacy endures, a reminder that freedom was forged not just by soldiers, but by the hands and hearts of women who stood steadfast, often unseen, behind the lines. Chapter 23. Cornwallis in the Trap. In the late summer of 1781, the tides of the American Revolutionary War converged on a small peninsula in Virginia, Yorktown, a place destined to become the crucible where the fate of an empire would be sealed. It was here that British General Lord Charles Cornwallis found himself ensnared in a trap meticulously crafted by the combined forces of the American Continental Army and their French allies. This decisive moment was not simply a military victory. It was the culmination of years of struggle, sacrifice, strategy, and indomitable will that brought a fractured rebellion to the cusp of triumph. Cornwallis, a seasoned British commander known for his tenacity and strategic acumen, had pressed his campaign deep into Virginia. His objective was clear: to secure the southern colonies, break the backbone of the insurgency, and deliver a crushing blow to the revolutionaries. But as Cornwallis advanced, he entered a web of alliances, naval prowess, and tactical ingenuity that would ultimately entrap him. The British Southern Campaign had gained momentum in 1780 with victories in Charleston and a string of engagements that seemed to solidify British control. Yet, beneath this veneer of dominance, the seeds of their undoing were being sown. Guerrilla warfare, harassing raids by patriot militias, and dwindling Loyalist support eroded British strength. The American forces, under the leadership of General George Washington, along with French military commanders and naval officers, began to orchestrate a decisive counterattack. The French involvement was pivotal. France, eager to avenge its own losses to Britain in earlier conflicts and to weaken its old rival, had entered the war openly in 1778. French troops under General Jean-Baptiste Donatien de Vimeur, Comte de Rochambeau, arrived in America, bringing fresh manpower, supplies, and a sophisticated understanding of siege warfare. More importantly, the French Navy, commanded by Admiral François-Joseph Paul de Grasse, controlled the seas along the American coastline, a crucial factor that would shape the Yorktown campaign. A.S. Cornwallis fortified Yorktown, expecting resupply and reinforcement via the Chesapeake Bay. The French fleet intercepted and decisively defeated the British Navy at the Battle of the Chesapeake. This naval victory was more than a tactical success. It was a strategic masterstroke that sealed Cornwallis's fate. With the British fleet blocked from entry, Cornwallis was isolated, cut off from escape or reinforcement. On land, Washington and Rochambeau moved with precision, coordinating a combined Franco-American force that marched south from New York. Their aim was to trap Cornwallis between the swelling Continental Army and the French fleet controlling the bay. This extraordinary feat of joint planning and rapid mobilization showcased the growing maturity and professionalism of the American forces, transforming from a ragtag militia into a capable and coordinated army. The siege of Yorktown began in earnest in late September 1781. The Allied forces surrounded Cornwallis's troops, digging trenches, establishing artillery positions, and cutting off supply lines. The battle that unfolded was brutal and relentless, a grueling test of endurance for both sides. The British, though well-entrenched, found themselves increasingly outmatched, their positions battered by constant bombardment and their hopes of relief dashed by the naval blockade. Cornwallis's predicament was dire. His troops suffered from dwindling supplies, sickness, and fatigue. Morale wavered as the reality of encirclement settled in. Yet, Cornwallis fought on, embodying the resolve that had marked his career. He attempted sorties and defensive maneuvers, but the tightening noose was inexorable, the American and French. Soldiers shared in the hardship, laboring through mud, rain, and exhaustion. The siege demanded immense physical and psychological fortitude, testing the bonds of camaraderie and the depth of commitment to the revolutionary cause. For many, the weeks at Yorktown were among the harshest of the war, but their resolve never faltered. As October approached, the inevitability of British surrender became apparent. On October 17th, after weeks of relentless siege, Cornwallis sent emissaries to negotiate terms. The formal surrender took place on October 19, 1781, a momentous event that reverberated across continents. The sight of British troops laying down their arms signaled not just a battlefield loss, but the effective end of British ambitions in the American colonies. Yorktown was a profound turning point. It demonstrated the power of alliance, the significance of naval control, and the effectiveness of coordinated land campaigns. More than that, it was a human story of endurance, strategy, and the will to forge a new nation. For Cornwallis, the trap at Yorktown was a bitter defeat, but also a chapter in a long military career marked by bravery and complex loyalties. For Washington, Rochambeau, and the revolutionaries, it was the moment when hope crystallized into victory. A victory born from the sacrifices of countless individuals, from soldiers in the trenches to citizens supporting the cause. The victory at Yorktown did not end the war immediately, but it set in motion the political and diplomatic processes that would bring formal peace. Negotiations began that eventually led to the Treaty of Paris in 1783, recognizing American independence. Yorktown stands today not merely as a historical event, but as a symbol, a testament to the resilience, unity, and vision of a people who dared to challenge an empire and redefine the world order. Chapter 24. The World Turned Upside Down. October of 1781, an autumn month heavy with tension and portent, would mark a moment in history when the world, as it was known, began to tilt, shift, and ultimately transform. The sun had not yet fully risen over the fields surrounding Yorktown, Virginia, but already the air was thick with anticipation, charged with the weight of events that would echo far beyond the tobacco farms and riverbanks of the American South. This was the day when hope, despair, and destiny collided, when the thunder of muskets and cannon fire gave way to silence, and the dream of a new nation leapt from the realm of possibility into the hard soil of reality. The siege of Yorktown was no mere battle. It was the decisive crescendo of a war that had spanned 6 years, countless miles, and the hearts of millions. It was the moment when the colonies, battered yet unbroken, stood as one against the might of the British Empire. It was a battle not just of armies, but of ideals, of liberty against tyranny, self-determination against colonial subjugation. General George Washington, Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army, had spent months orchestrating this final act with meticulous care. His strategy was bold: to trap the British Army, led by General Charles Cornwallis, on the Yorktown Peninsula, a narrow strip of land bounded by the York and James Rivers. But Washington could not do it alone. His plans depended on a fragile alliance with France, a partnership forged through shared struggle and mutual ambition. The French Navy, under Admiral de Grasse, played an indispensable role, controlling the Chesapeake Bay and cutting off any hope of British escape or reinforcement. As the French fleet sailed into the bay, the British found themselves caught in a tightening noose. Cornwallis, aware of the peril but lacking options, fortified his positions around Yorktown, digging trenches and erecting redoubts. The British were seasoned soldiers, disciplined and battle-hardened, but the encirclement was relentless. Day after day, the American and French forces advanced their lines. Inching closer to their quarry, the siege was grueling. Soldiers on both sides endured the biting cold, relentless artillery barrages, and the constant threat of disease and starvation. The rhythm of war was a harrowing lullaby of gunfire, cries, and whispered prayers. Yet, amidst the hardship, camaraderie and determination flourished. The ragtag Continental Army, once mocked for its lack of training and resources, now fought with the skill and spirit of veterans. French soldiers, too, proved invaluable, their discipline and firepower turning the tide alongside their American allies. For Cornwallis, the situation grew increasingly desperate. His communications were cut, his supplies dwindling. The promise of relief from the British fleet vanished with Admiral Graves' defeat at the Battle of the Chesapeake. Trapped and isolated, he faced a grim calculus: fight to the last man, attempt a perilous breakout, or surrendered on October 17, 1781. Cornwallis chose to surrender, his white flag raised over Yorktown's ramparts, signaling the end of major combat in the Revolutionary War. The event was both a climax and a commencement, the collapse of British hopes for reclaiming their rebellious colonies, and the dawning of a new era. The surrender ceremony was solemn and striking in its symbolism. Thousands gathered to witness the British troops, once invincible in the eyes of the world's great powers, lay down their arms. General Washington accepted Cornwallis's sword, though the defeated general was conspicuously absent, citing illness, sending his subordinate to surrender instead. It was a moment heavy with irony and portent, a tangible symbol of an empire's retreat and a nation's birth. News of Yorktown's fall spread rapidly, igniting celebrations across the colonies. Bells rang, fires blazed, and people danced in the streets. The revolutionaries had triumphed against overwhelming odds, a victory born of perseverance, sacrifice, and an unyielding belief in freedom. Yet, even in triumph, uncertainty lingered. The war was not officially over. Formal negotiations would drag on for 2 more years, culminating in the Treaty of Paris in 1783. But Yorktown was the turning point, a point of no return. The victory at Yorktown reverberated globally. It inspired oppressed peoples and challenged the established order of monarchies and empires. The American Revolution's ideals, liberty, equality, and democracy, became a beacon, igniting future struggles for self-determination around the world. The world was, indeed, turned upside down. A new nation emerged from the crucible of war, its foundations steeped in the hopes and sacrifices of countless men and women. The fields of Yorktown, once stained with blood and echoed with gunfire, would become hallowed ground, a testament to the enduring power of freedom and the indomitable human spirit. As the sun set on that fateful October day, it cast long shadows over a continent forever changed. The age of empire was waning. The age of republics was dawning, and the story of America, the story of a people's quest to define their own destiny, had only just begun. Chapter 25: Peace Talks and Power Plays. The war had waged for years, blood spilled on distant battlefields, dreams forged in hardship and sacrifice. Now, as the guns fell silent after Yorktown, a new and delicate struggle began, not of muskets and cannons, but of words, whispers, and cunning diplomacy. The grand stage was set in the glittering salons of Paris, a city alive with intrigue and ambition. Here, the fate of a fledgling nation would be decided in quiet conference rooms and candlelit chambers, where power plays and persuasion were weapons as potent as any sword. From 1782 to 1783, the American commissioners, tasked with securing peace and recognition, found themselves navigating a complex web of international politics. They were not merely negotiating with Britain, but balancing the interests of France, Spain, and the Dutch Republic. each eager to shape the new order in their favor. The American delegation, led by Benjamin Franklin, John Jay, and John Adams, had to be shrewd, united, and resilient. Their objective was clear: to secure independence, favorable boundaries, and a future free from the shadows of empire. In the glittering salons of Paris, Franklin's charm and wisdom shone brightly. His reputation as a philosopher and statesman preceded him, earning respect from European courts. Yet, beneath the polite conversation lay fierce competition. France, having borne heavy costs in blood and treasure to aid the American cause, sought to limit America's expansion, wary of a too powerful neighbor. Spain, too, pressed for territorial gains, particularly concerned about the Mississippi River and Florida. The Dutch watched carefully, eager to regain influence. The British, humbled by their defeat, were determined to preserve as much influence as possible. Their negotiators sought to fracture the alliance between America and France, hoping to isolate the young republic and soften its demands. The tension in the air was palpable, a high-stakes game of diplomacy where one misstep could undo years of sacrifice. Despite the pressures, the American commissioners held firm. John Jay, frustrated by the slow pace and competing interests of their French allies, took a bold step. He opened direct negotiations with the British. This maneuver shocked their French partners, who feared being sidelined, but it underscored America's determination to secure the best possible terms. The resulting Treaty of Paris, signed in September 1783, was a remarkable achievement. It recognized the United States as a free and independent nation, granting it boundaries far more generous than many had anticipated. The Mississippi River to the west, the Great Lakes to the north, and the northern border with Spanish Canada were all secured. Fishing rights off Newfoundland provided economic opportunity, and the treaty promised the restoration of property and rights to Loyalists. Though in practice, this promise proved difficult to enforce, the negotiations reflected the evolving balance of power, signaling the decline of British imperial dominance and the rise of new geopolitical dynamics. For the United States, the treaty was both an end and a beginning, a formal birth certificate for a nation that had fought fiercely for its existence, now poised to step onto the world stage. Yet, the peace was fragile. Challenges lay ahead: internal divisions, the task of building a government, and the complex realities of a diverse and expanding territory. The Treaty of Paris had secured independence, but the work of nation-building demanded far greater endurance and vision. The story of the peace talks is a testament to the power of diplomacy, the importance of unity, and the relentless pursuit of liberty. It reminds us that wars are not won by force alone, but by the courage to negotiate, compromise, and imagine a better future. As the candles flickered in Parisian salons and the ink dried on parchment, a new chapter in history was written, one that would shape not only a continent, but the ideals of freedom and self-determination across the world. Chapter 26. Farewell, Commander. The war was over. The cannons had fallen silent. The colonies, once a scattered collection of rebellious provinces, had united to create a new nation, one built upon principles of liberty, self-governance, and the radical idea that power should reside with the people, not a king. But as the dust settled on the battlefields, a question lingered in the hearts of many. What would become of the man who had led them through the storm? The man who had borne the weight of command, who had carried the hopes of millions on his shoulders. George Washington. It was a moment unlike any other in history. For centuries, victorious generals had seized power, crowned themselves kings, or otherwise transformed their military triumphs into personal rule. The world was familiar with the image of the warlord who became emperor, the dictator who seized control in the name of order and strength. But Washington's choice would shatter this pattern. He would, instead, do something unprecedented. He would relinquish power and return it to the people. In December of 1783, Washington made his way to Annapolis, Maryland, the temporary capital of the fledgling United States. The mood was heavy with significance. Here, before the Congress of the Confederation, Washington would formally resign his commission as Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army. It was a simple act on its surface, a handing over of a sword, a speech, a signature, but in its symbolism, it was revolutionary. Washington was not seizing power. He was giving it up. On December 23rd, in a chamber filled with political leaders and citizens alike, Washington stepped forward. The room was hushed, every eye fixed upon the man who had become the embodiment of the American cause. His voice, steady and resolute, carried through the room as he addressed the assembly. I consider it an indispensable duty to close this last solemn act of my official life by commending the interests of our dearest country to the protection of Almighty God and those who have the superintendence of them to His holy keeping. With these words, he symbolized the profound humility and selflessness that marked his leadership, a leader who saw himself not as a ruler, but as a servant of the Republic. The sword of command was laid down. The general returned to private life, a farmer at Mount Vernon, leaving behind the grandeur and temptations of power. This moment, this gesture, was not merely a personal decision. It was a defining moment for a nation and for the world. Washington's resignation embodied the revolutionary ideal that no one man was above the law or the will of the people. It was a powerful rejection of tyranny, a living example of Republican virtue. News of Washington's resignation spread rapidly across the colonies and beyond the ocean. Across Europe, monarchs and political thinkers alike took note. Some were stunned, others inspired. Here was a man who had the power to become a monarch, yet chose the path of democracy. This act set a precedent, an example for generations to come. But the road to this moment had been long and fraught with challenges. Washington had borne the burdens of war with unwavering resolve. From the bitter winters at Valley Forge, where soldiers faced starvation and disease, to the hard-fought battles that tested the limits of endurance and courage, Washington stood as a pillar of strength and determination. His leadership was not without doubt or struggle. At times, the army was disorganized, resources scarce, morale low. Yet Washington's vision and perseverance held the fragile cause together. He was both commander and symbol, the living embodiment of the Revolution's promise. Beyond the battlefield, Washington understood the delicate balance of power and the dangers of ambition. He distrusted the allure of dictatorship and the corrupting influence of unchecked authority. His voluntary resignation was a conscious act to protect the republic he had helped birth. A.S. Washington returned to Mount Vernon. The public celebrated his return to civilian life with unprecedented admiration and respect. No triumphal parade declared a monarch's ascension. Instead, there was quiet reverence for a leader who had served with honor and then stepped away, ensuring that the nation would not become his kingdom. Washington's farewell also marked the beginning of the American experiment in democracy. It reinforced the principle that political power must be temporary and accountable. His actions helped inspire the drafting of the United States Constitution and the establishment of checks and balances that would safeguard liberty. In the years that followed, Washington's legacy as the father of his country grew, not just because of his military victories, but because of his character and his example. His farewell was a defining moment, a beacon of Republican values that would echo throughout history. The world had witnessed a departure from the norms of power and leadership. George Washington, the commander who had united colonies into a nation, chose to walk away from power, entrusting the future to the people he had fought to liberate. This act was more than personal humility. It was a profound statement of faith in democracy. It was a bold declaration that the revolution was not about replacing one ruler with another, but about creating a government of the people, by the people, and for the people. Washington's farewell remains one of the most powerful moments in the story of the American Revolution, an enduring testament to the ideals of freedom, leadership, and the relinquishing of power for the greater good. As the sun set over Mount Vernon, the nation stepped forward, inspired by the man who had led them to freedom and then, with grace and courage, returned that freedom to them. Chapter 27. Born of Fire. It was September 3rd, 1783, 3 in a quiet chamber tucked within the Grand Hotel de York in Paris, diplomats gathered around parchment. The room was calm, but the weight of centuries pressed into the ink about to be set to paper. Across the Atlantic, the guns had long fallen silent. But here, this moment, was the true conclusion of a revolution that had upended the world. The Treaty of Paris. With a few signatures, it was done. The British Crown, once the unquestioned ruler of the American colonies, had formally recognized the independence of the 13 United States of America. What began with musket smoke at Lexington now ended with ink in Paris. The empire had let go, and in its place, something utterly new had emerged. A republic, still trembling in its infancy, raw from war, uncertain of its future, but free. The treaty's terms were generous, astonishingly so. Britain ceded vast lands stretching from the Atlantic coast to the Mississippi River. America had not only won independence, it had gained an empire of its own. But beneath the triumph, there pulsed a deeper, more haunting question. Now what? The war had forged unity through necessity. But with the enemy gone, that fragile union began to fray. The 13 states, so often called united, were, in reality, 13 separate entities. They printed their own money. They raised their own militias. They levied tariffs against each other. And as British redcoats boarded ships to depart, the looming threat was no longer foreign tyranny, but internal collapse. There was no king, no parliament, no strong central government. Merely a confederation, a loose alliance of sovereign states bound by a document called the Articles of Confederation. It was a framework designed in wartime haste. Weak by design, it had no power to tax, no authority to regulate commerce, no real means to enforce law. It could request money from the states, but not compel it. It could raise an army, but not maintain one. It was a skeleton of governance. And now, that skeleton had to support the body of a nation. Economic chaos descended. War debts loomed large. Inflation spiraled. Veterans, many unpaid, returned to find their farms ruined, their families impoverished. Foreign creditors demanded their gold. The fledgling government had no treasury to speak of. In the shadows, European monarchs watched. Curious, skeptical, amused. Some predicted a collapse. Others waited for the states to turn on one another, hoping for an opening to regain control. The very idea of a republic, born of revolution, terrified the crowned heads of Europe, and perhaps, most dangerous of all, the people themselves were angry, frustrated, afraid. In western Massachusetts, in 1786, that fear exploded into rebellion. Daniel Shays, once a Continental Army captain, led thousands of disgruntled farmers in armed protest. They stormed courthouses, blocked foreclosures, demanded debt relief. The government's response? Slow, ineffective. It was a terrifying wake-up call. If the government couldn't stop an uprising in its own backyard, what kind of nation was this really? The war may have ended, but the revolution, its meaning, its structure, its survival, was still being written. In state capitals and taverns, churches and town halls, the people debated. What should this country become? Could 13 states act as one? Should there be a president, a Congress, a national court? Among the founding generation, there were deep divisions. Thomas Jefferson believed in strong local control, wary of centralized power. He envisioned a nation of farmers and freeholders, with minimal interference from a distant capital. Alexander Hamilton, by contrast, saw danger in decentralization. He called for a strong national government, powerful enough to bind the states, pay debts, defend borders, and project stability abroad. James Madison, the young Virginian scholar, worked feverishly to study republics of the past, Greece, Rome, Florence, searching for lessons, warning signs, designs that might prevent the decay that had doomed so many before. And looming above them all was Washington, still silent, still revered, watching from Mount Vernon. The Treaty of Paris had made America a country, but that country had no clear map, no engine to drive it forward. And without vision, victory would be meaningless. A great experiment had begun, but it teetered on the edge of the unknown. Yet even in the chaos, there was hope. Across the new nation, people tasted freedom for the first time. Not as a slogan, not as a dream, but as lived reality. They voted for local leaders. They petitioned their governments. They spoke openly in taverns without fear of royal reprisal. The spirit of liberty was alive, messy, passionate, and defiant. Printers, freed from crown censors, unleashed a storm of pamphlets and papers. The press became the pulsing heart of American discourse. Every citizen with a quill could shape the nation's future. Religious freedom flourished in ways once unthinkable. No longer tethered to an official church, Americans explored faith with newfound autonomy. Baptists, Methodists, Quakers, all found voice and place in the revolutionary soil. And in the schools, new ideas took root. Civics, history, law. The children of the revolution would be raised not as subjects, but as citizens, taught that their voice mattered, that government was theirs to shape, that IT was not perfect. Far from it, slavery still poisoned the promise of liberty, haunting every state in different degrees. Women remained excluded from the political sphere. Native nations, once courted as allies, were now pushed back, betrayed, and displaced as settlers surged westward. But still, something astonishing had occurred: that a people had risen, cast off empire, claimed independence, and now stood blinking in the morning light, asking what to do with it. The Treaty of Paris ended the war. But peace was not the same as unity. Sovereignty was not the same as ordered. In the years ahead, the nation would stumble. It would argue. It would fracture and heal, then fracture again. But out of this fire, this long crucible of war, sacrifice, and uncertainty, an identity was forming. Not British, not colonial, not aristocratic. American. A word still raw with meaning, still finding its shape. It had been forged not in palaces, but in fields and forests, in blood and ink. It had been earned, inch by inch, life by life, and as the final redcoats disappeared over the Atlantic horizon, the people of this new nation turned inward, toward themselves, toward each other, to decide what freedom would truly mean. The war had given them liberty. Now they would have to give it structure. And in doing so, they would define not just a country, but a concept that would shake the very foundations of the world. Chapter 28. Legacy of Revolution. The American Revolution did not end when the cannons fell silent, nor did its true legacy lie only in the soil it won. It lived on, in ink and blood, in debates and ballots, in the fragile breath of a new idea struggling to survive. The war had overthrown an empire, but what it truly ignited was a revolution of thought. For the first time in modern history, a people had risen, not to place a new king upon the throne, but to reject kings altogether. Power, they declared, did not flow down from heaven. It rose from the consent of the governed. The Declaration of Independence was more than a severance of ties. It was a manifesto of ideals. That all men are created equal. That they are endowed with unalienable rights. That government exists to protect those rights, and may be altered or abolished if it fails to do so. These were not just words. They were dynamite, and the explosion was not confined to America. It echoed outward, across oceans, borders, and empires. In Paris, radicals whispered of liberté. In Haiti, enslaved men and women saw the spark of freedom and fanned it into flame. Across Latin America, across Europe, across every place where power was hoarded and freedom denied, the American Revolution stood as proof that the old order could be broken. But within the new United States, the battle for meaning had only just begun. Independence was not structure. Liberty was not law. And idealism alone would not bind 13 fractious states into one enduring nation. The Articles of Confederation had failed. The economy teetered. Foreign threats loomed. And so, once more, the founding generation gathered, in secrecy, in sweltering heat, behind closed doors in Philadelphia, to forge a new path. What emerged in 1787 was nothing short of audacious. The Constitution of the United States, here for the first time, was a written charter designed not to enshrine monarchy, but to limit power, to balance it, to divide it, to subject it to the will of the people. Three branches. Checks and balances. A president who would serve, not rule. A Congress of states and people. A judiciary to interpret law, not impose it. The Constitution was not perfect. It was a compromise, deeply flawed, morally torn by the issue of slavery, haunted by omissions that would take generations to confront. But it was alive. It was amendable. It was designed to evolve. And that evolution began immediately. In 1791, the Bill of Rights was added. 10 amendments born from the demands of a people still wary of power. Speech, religion, assembly, the right to bear arms, protection from tyranny not only from kings, but from their own. With these additions, the Republic gained its backbone. The experiment had a framework. The revolution had a rulebook, and with it, the world watched. Monarchs. The Constitution was a threat wrapped in parchment. To revolutionaries, it was a blueprint for rebellion. And to oppressed peoples, it became a distant star by which to navigate their own struggles. But the road was not smooth. Within a decade, political parties emerged, Federalists and Democratic Republicans, each claiming to speak for the soul of the revolution. The ink had barely dried, and already the meaning of liberty was contested. What did equality mean in a nation where slavery still thrived? Who counted as the people? Women? The poor? The propertyless? The answers were neither immediate nor just. The revolution had opened the door, but the march toward justice would be long and often bitter. Yet, even in its contradictions, America had done something extraordinary. It had planted the idea that freedom was not a gift of the elite, but a birthright. That sovereignty did not belong to kings, but to the people. This idea would inspire generations. In 1789, just 6 years after Yorktown, the French Revolution erupted. In 1804, Haiti would declare independence, the first free black republic. In the decades that followed, Latin American nations would rise, armed with Enlightenment ideals and the belief that empire could be overthrown. Even in Britain, reformers began to question the divine right of kings. In time, suffrage expanded. Constitutional monarchies emerged. The idea of a citizen, rather than a subject, took root in the global conscience, and it had begun in Philadelphia, in Boston, in the swamps of Carolina and the frozen fields of Valley Forge. But legacies are not static. The American Revolution's greatest legacy was not that it ended tyranny once, but that it left behind a framework to challenge it again and again. The Civil War would reopen the question of equality. The suffrage movement would demand a seat for women at the table. The civil rights movement would force the nation to confront its original sin. Each time, Americans would look backward, not to long for kings, but to measure how far they'd come from the promises made in 1776. The revolution, then, was not a moment, but a movement, not a chapter, but a call. It called upon every generation to ask hard questions. What does liberty mean? Who gets to share in it? How do we balance freedom with order, rights with responsibility? The answers were never easy. But the questions, those questions, were the revolution's true gift. In classrooms and courtrooms, in protests and elections, the spirit of that revolution still lingers. It pulses in the oath of a new citizen. It echoes in the quiet solitude of a ballot booth. It lives in dissent, in debate, in the simple act of raising a voice. The American Revolution did not give the world perfection, but it gave the world permission to dream of government not ruled by fear, but founded on hope. Believe that history can be rewritten, not just by kings and generals, but by farmers, printers, blacksmiths, and thinkers. Understand that a nation, true and just, is not built by conquest, but by conviction. And though the founding fathers are long gone, their revolution endures, not in statues or parades, but in the restless demand for something better, more just, more free, more human. That is the legacy of revolution, born in fire, carried in ink, endless in its pursuit.